Welcome, everyone. This is your friend, the DN What If, here with another exciting fanfiction. Today, we're diving into the story of what if Deku destroyed himself because of some bad habits? If you enjoy this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more fanfiction content just like this. Now, let's get started with the fanfic. Izuku Midoriya was well aware he had some not great habits. If you asked his teachers, they'd probably tell you that he had a habit of getting into trouble with villains and breaking his bones. If you asked his friends, some of them might bring up his mumbling, or maybe his inability to accept compliments. If you asked Shinso, he'd bring up Izuku's poor sleeping habits. Izuku and the insomniac had spent a decent number of nights together down in the common room when neither could sleep. But, while those were all habits of Izuku's, he didn't really mean to do any of them. Some of them he really couldn't help, breaking his bones for example. It wasn't exactly his fault that he'd been given an overpowered quirk and no instruction as for how to use it. The sleeping thing too, it wasn't his fault that nightmare of villains kept him up. The mumbling and rejection of compliments were just left over from childhood, they really were just in his nature, much like smiling and helping and kindness were. He could try to change them, but he didn't really think it'd work. There were some habits, however, that Izuku did mean to do. And they certainly weren't healthy, but they weren't serious. And after a long day of hero training, Izuku allowed himself to indulge in one of these habits. After dinner, he showered and put on a comfortable pair of sweatpants with an oversized t-shirt before walking down to the kitchen and making a large mug of jasmine tea. Momo had made it clear that anyone was allowed to use the various teas she had in her collection, but Izuku always felt a bit bad about it. At first he tried to get his own separate boxes, but Momo had seemed downright scandalized that he'd buy such cheap tea. Eventually he'd given up and just used hers. It wasn't worth the argument, and he didn't want to offend her in some way. He ran into Bakugo in the kitchen. The blonde had been the one to make dinner and was doing the dishes with Kirishima. Izuku and Bakugo's relationship had improved a lot since the beginning of UA. He'd go as far to say he could once again consider the angry Pomeranian a friend. Sure, he had never really stopped calling him that even when the bullying was at its worst, but still. It was nice. Kirishima was excitedly blabbering to the blonde, who would occasionally huff or roll his eyes in response. Izuku didn't say anything, opting to just nod a greeting and make his tea in silence. Once he had discarded the tea bag, he walked back up to his room and set the mug down on the floor before pulling a blue throw blanket off of his bed and folding it on the floor. He lit a lilac-scented candle and grabbed a soft gray washcloth. Then he walked over to the drawer of sewing supplies he had in his desk. He didn't sew often but had picked up the skill by patching up burned middle school uniforms. It was a good skill to have and had proven equally useful for patching up rips in his gym uniform from when training got rough. So, no one questioned why he had a drawer full of sewing supplies. In the drawer he had 2 boxes of pins. One was new and was the one that he actually used for sewing. The second box was left over from childhood, scratched up and full of old, sometimes bent pins that he just hadn't gotten rid of yet. In this second box, there was also a small collection of razors. He pulled out the razors and placed them on top of a tissue on the floor next to his tea. Next, he pulled out the first aid kit from his backpack and took out the antiseptic spray, which was also placed next to his tea. Finally, he locked his door, put in his earbuds and sat down on the blanket. He just sat there for a few minutes, sipping his tea and staring at his ceiling, letting the slow music in his ears lull him into a hazy, faraway place. After a little while though, he set to work. First, he tugged his shirt off and folded it next to him. Then he pulled his sweatpants and boxers down low enough to expose 2 patches of cuts on his hips. One on each side, perfectly symmetrical. The skin was red, littered with enough partially healed cuts and old scars that you couldn't even see what his skin had looked like before. He had scrubbed at the patches in the shower and put lotion on them to help soften the scarred skin. It was difficult to cut through scabs, so he always tried to soften them. The first few cuts he made weren't deep by any means, just thin lines where blood bubbled up to the surface in little droplets. The red made him feel even further away, like he was floating on a cloud far from all of his problems and stress. He carefully added another set of shallow lines in the spaces left by the first pass. A little bit more blood spilled out. He hardly even noticed the sting. He wished he could cut deeper, let the blood pool and run down his thighs, but for whatever reason he never seemed to be able to push the blade deeper. Maybe it was just the fact that the blade was small, or maybe it was his subconscious trying to stop him from doing something that was objectively pretty dumb. He doubted that though, given that his subconscious never stopped him from breaking his bones. Either way, Izuku simply added more cuts instead of cutting deeper. By the time he was done on his right hip, the patch almost looked like he had road rash. He moved on to his other hip, making the two as symmetrical as possible. He wasn't sure why exactly he needed them to be even, but he did. His therapist had said that it might be an OCD compulsion. He wasn't formally diagnosed, but this paired with a few other behaviors he had pointed towards OCD. And yeah, his therapist knew. He had been seeing her for the better part of a year before mentioning it to her. He had been worried that she'd call the police or make him throw out the razors. She hadn't done either of those things, however, instead asking to explain what he felt when he cut. Asking him if there were specific triggers, and how often he did it, as well as when he had started. He had started the first year of middle school, and sometimes he did it every day. Other times he'd be clean for months at a time. There wasn't much of a pattern for it, nor were there specific triggers. Hell, sometimes he cut on good days. Days where he was happy and smiling genuinely. Days where he laughed with his friends or took notes and drew in his room. He'd spend the whole day feeling great, and then out of nowhere would find himself seated on his floor, razor in hand. It wasn't even that he was no longer in a good mood, often the good mood remained throughout and after the session. He'd been confused about that. This was another reason his therapist thought it might be a compulsion. After he had told her all of this, she helped him come up with a list of other coping mechanisms to try. They ranged from talking to his mom, to watching movies, to drawing or baking sweets. They helped sometimes, but most of the time he'd just end up cutting after he was done. He knew it was bad, but it didn't feel bad. It left him feeling floaty, distant, and yet grounded at the same time. It was meditative almost. It wasn't like he hated himself. He liked himself a lot actually. Even if he had trouble accepting compliments, he still knew he was a good person. He liked his personality, he liked his body, he liked his life. And it wasn't like he was suicidal either, he didn't want to die. Sure, he knew that it was a possibility as a hero in training that he'd die young, but he wasn't seeking it out. There was too much to live for. His mom, his friends, his teachers watching the sun rise on early morning jogs, drawing. He didn't want to die. He just had odd ways of coping with living. Speaking of which, cutting wasn't his only bad habit, though it was his favorite in a weird way. It was the calmest, it let him be quiet and relaxed. His second most common habit was scratching. When he was upset, he'd scratch at his arms and leave red welts where blood vessels had popped. His therapist seemed more worried about the cutting than the scratching, but Izuku felt like the scratching was worse. It hurt more, oddly enough, and the pain stayed longer, making his showers sting. The scratching was calming sometimes, but it was so often paired with frantic crying that it didn't really register in his mind as meditative like cutting did. On a similar route was pulling at his hair or hitting himself. Neither was exactly calming, even if they helped ground him when he was panicking. One that was closer to the meditative feel of cutting was holding his breath. It seemed odd, but if he held it long enough he'd get lightheaded and dizzy and his hearing would fade in and out along with his vision. It was nice, but honestly, the process of getting himself to that floaty place was long and boring. Lastly was gagging himself, throwing up in the toilet, or on occasion coughing up bits of bile in the shower. When all of this started the first year of middle school, Izuku had been numb. He didn't feel good, he hardly felt anything. He wanted to cry and get the feeling of emptiness out, but no matter how hard he tried he just couldn't do it. It was weird, seeing as he was such a crybaby now. But back then he had no way to get the ick out, and eventually he turned to vomiting on his bathroom floor. It helped some, but he eventually stopped for fear of the stomach acid ruining his teeth. The first time he cut was when he felt numb and wanted to cry as well. He thought that maybe the pain would jumpstart his tear ducts. It hadn't worked, but apparently one time was all it took to set the habit. He started with only 2 tiny lines on each of his hips, where he could be sure nobody would see them. Over time the cuts grew in number and length, and patches appeared on other places of his body. Inner thighs, ankles, on his ribs. A few times even he cut the backs of his hands. That had been the result of an intrusive thought, where he pictured dozens of cuts all over his hands and arms. Thankfully he'd been able to stick to one slice on the back of each hand. They had been annoying as hell to hide, but thankfully if anyone saw them, they were too polite to say anything. At first, he had been determined not to tell anybody, but eventually he slipped. It was actually Bakugo who found out first. He had been yelling at the freckled boy after school one day. They were practically neighbors, so they often ended up walking home, not exactly together but nearby each other. The blonde had said something along the lines of how he was surprised Izuku didn't cut himself with how pathetic he was. Izuku had apparently made a face at that and the blonde knew right away. He'd actually seemed pretty concerned, yelling at Izuku to throw the razors out, to talk to someone instead. He even threatened to follow Izuku home and throw the razors out himself. Izuku, however, had explained that if he got rid of the razors, that didn't get rid of the urge. He'd probably turn to using something like a kitchen knife, or something else that he wasn't experienced with, or something that wasn't as easy to maneuver. That could be dangerous, maybe even lead to more damage. Bakugo hadn't been happy about that argument, but eventually gave up. After that, the bullying eased up a lot, Bakugo even defending Izuku on occasion. It made him feel awful. He felt guilty and stupid and horrible that Bakugo thought it was his fault. It wasn't his fault. It wasn't anyone's fault really. Izuku had cut more than ever before the night after Bakugo found out. After his childhood friend knew, Izuku thought that maybe he should tell his mom. He knew she'd worry, but he'd rather tell her of his own free will than risk her finding out on her own. The conversation had gone about as he thought it would. She had cried, hugged him, asked him why, begged him to stop. He gave his excuse for keeping the razors and refused to tell her where they were. He knew she respected his privacy too much to search through his stuff for them. Eventually she got him a notebook, different from all his other ones, for him to keep as a journal. She thought that writing his feelings down might help, and then asked him to come to her if he ever felt the urge come on. The journal helped some, but eventually it just became a log of what days he cut. He talked to his mom a few times but always felt worse after. Eventually he told his therapist and ran into a similar issue. He always seemed to feel worse, to have a stronger urge after talking to her about it. So he stopped talking about it. He lied, said that the coping mechanisms had helped him enough to quit. He knew that saying he quit cold turkey wasn't realistic, so he made sure to mention to his mom a few times that he had the urge, and that he needed her help to stay clean. And if he made himself tea, sat on his floor and took out his razors once she went to bed, that was for him to know and her to never find out. That was another thing, he had a sort of ritual with his self-harm. It was meditative and relaxing, almost a reward at times despite how fucked up it was. He'd always make tea, get out a soft blanket and light a candle. Sometimes he'd run a bath and cut in there, or in the shower, but most of the time he set himself up on the floor of his bedroom in front of his mirror. The mirror helped him see what he was doing with the cuts on his ribs, when it was uncomfortable to crane his neck down and look at what he was doing. It was nice. It was stupid and not healthy and illogical, but it was nice. It wasn't like he was doing any real harm, the cuts were shallow and healed up in a few days. He made sure to keep them clean, and he never used dirty razors. He usually didn't bandage the cuts because they weren't really bad enough to warrant using a bandage, but on occasion if they stung more than usual, he'd cover them, just so that they wouldn't rub against his clothes. Back to the present, however, Izuku had finished his tea and was in the process of cleaning his wounds with the antiseptic and a washcloth. He blew out the candle, pulled up his pants and put on his shirt before folding the blanket back on his bed and rinsing the washcloth out in the sink before placing it in his hamper. He then brought his mug down to the kitchen to clean. He was walking a little funny at the feeling of the fresh cuts on his inner thighs as he walked, but it wasn't noticeable. He nodded a hello to Shinso, who was scrolling through his phone on one of the couches. He didn't really feel like talking. He was still floaty and far away and talking felt wrong. He had been working on learning sign language, partially for people like Present Mike and Bakugo, who were hard of hearing, and partially for when he felt like this. For when the world was too loud, and he didn't want to add to it. When he needed silence. When it felt icky and gross and wrong to so much as hum a verbal response to his friends. After he washed and put away his mug, Izuku wandered back up to his room, put his razors away, and set his alarm before going to sleep. He felt good. Izuku had another habit. This one wasn't really bad, but it was a habit nonetheless. He liked to go up on rooftops. Not to jump or anything like that, just to watch the stars at night, or watch the clouds roll by. To revel in the quiet and breathe in the fresh air. To be alone. This particular habit had become much harder to maintain once he moved into the dorms. Back at his apartment with his mom, no one questioned him when he'd slip out the never-locked roof access door. But here at UA, there were alarms in place that would notify his teachers or the principal if he snuck out onto the roof. He knew this because Shiro and Denki had gone out on the roof to see if it was possible for Denki to act as a lightning rod. Mr. Aizawa hadn't been too happy about that one. There was, however, a loophole to this. If he simply used his quirk to jump from his balcony up to the roof, it would bypass the door alarm. And, if he kept away from certain sections of the roof, Nizu's cameras wouldn't catch him either. So, one night after indulging in some meditation, when he wasn't tired but didn't feel like running into Shinso downstairs, he went up to the roof. The air was cool, and the sky was mostly clear, with only a few wispy clouds drifting by. He laid back and shivered at the cold concrete against his back. He was wearing an old all-might hoodie, but the bite of the cold still got to him. It was nice though, and after watching the stars for who knows how long, he ended up drifting off. His phone alarm would wake him up for class, except, of course, for the fact that he had left his phone in his room. The problem child wasn't in class. Aizawa had thought it was odd that the kid wasn't early. He was often there before Aizawa himself showed up. He had thought it was even more odd when the student didn't show up at all, and it was downright concerning when he asked the rest of the class if they knew where he was. "I didn't see him at breakfast this morning. I figured he was just on one of his morning runs. It is dishonorable that a UA student is this late to class. I don't know where else he would be. Why would I know where the damn nerd is?" To say the least, Aizawa was worried. As much as he'd never admit it, he cared deeply for all of his students. He especially cared for Shinso, considering that he had adopted the boy just after he entered UA, saving him from a broken foster system that was cruel to kids with less than ideal quirks. He also had a soft spot for his resident problem child in particular, if only because he spent so much time talking to the kid while he was in the infirmary. Also, he had good reason to be worried that the brat wasn't in class. It seemed like every time the kid left his line of sight he'd come back with broken bones and mental trauma. He was glad the kid was getting therapy. After the first villain attack, the school had made every student in Class 1A visit the school's counselor Hound Dog. Midoriya, however, had explained that he already had a therapist that he was comfortable with. Aizawa had been excessively glad, as so often high schoolers, hero students especially, thought that seeking out help made them weak or less than. So, he was glad that the kid was willing to get help. But back to the task at hand, tracking the green-haired teenager down. After homeroom was dismissed, he told his husband Hisashi what was going on and went to check the dorms. Maybe the kid had just slept in or wasn't feeling well. Of course, this is exactly what had happened. Izuku had slept in, but he wasn't in his dorm. He was curled up behind the railing of the roof, sleeping soundly, unaware of the rising panic his teacher felt when he found Izuku's dorm empty, phone left on the bedside table. Aizawa ran straight to Nizu's office, planning on checking the security footage from the night before to make sure the kid hadn't been kidnapped. They pulled up the footage of the dorm and watched as, in the dead of night, the kid walked out onto his balcony and jumped onto the roof, immediately disappearing from the view of any of the cameras. The fact that the teen hadn't been kidnapped made Aizawa breathe a sigh of relief, but also led to him groaning in frustration. He was still worried about the kid. Going up to the roof in the middle of the night definitely set off some red flags in Aizawa's mind. He remained calm as he walked up to the roof of Heights Alliance and ended up suppressing a fond smile when the sleeping form of his student came into view. Aizawa was no stranger to dark circles, living off coffee and jelly pouches, but it always pained him to see the same circles on his students. The kid may have given him a bit of a heart attack that morning, but at least he was getting some sleep. Though Aizawa doubted the roof was particularly comfortable. The pro walked up to his student and crouched down next to him. The curled-up teen reminded Aizawa of the various stray cats he saw on patrol. He had to restrain himself a great deal to keep from scooping all the furballs up and taking them home. He did always carry a few treats with him though. After a few seconds, Aizawa carefully shook the teen awake. Izuku blinked groggily at him before sitting straight up and smacking into his teacher's chin. They both groaned a bit in pain, and Izuku seemed to finally realize what had happened, as a steady stream of apologies and excuses began flowing from his mouth. Kid, I'm so sorry. I must have left my phone in my room. Kid. And I must have missed class if you're here looking for me. I'm so sorry. Problem child. Izuku finally looked up at that, broken from his apologies. He made eye contact with Aizawa before looking very pointedly at the ground. Listen kid, I'm not mad. Sure, you broke a few rules and missed class, but if anyone can afford to miss a few notes it's you. I'm just glad you're okay. I thought you might have gotten into trouble or something. The teen looked guilty nonetheless and muttered out a few more apologies for the worry that he'd caused. It's okay really, I'm not going to punish you. But I am wondering, why are you up on the roof anyway? Aizawa had been planning on giving his student detention when he missed class, but after learning that he had apparently spent the night on the roof, all plans for punishment disappeared. He was just too worried at the implications he was seeing to really think about doing anything other than wrapping the kid up in blankets and making sure he was safe. I guess sometimes I just come up here for some peace and quiet. Aizawa raised an eyebrow, but said nothing as his student continued, the dorms can be kinda loud you know, and sometimes I just need the fresh air. I couldn't sleep last night so I came up here. I know we aren't supposed to, but it's just really nice. I ended up falling asleep I guess, and I must have left my phone in my room. I'm really sorry. I get it if you say I can't come up here anymore. Aizawa searched his kid's face for any trace of lie or deception, and when he found none, he sighed and shifted from a crouch into a seated position. I'm not gonna tell you that you can't come up here anymore. I get what you mean about needing quiet. Hoping rooftops at night is one of my favorite parts of being an underground hero. And besides, with that little loophole you found to get up here, I doubt you'd stop even if I asked. The kid at least had the decency to look a bit meek at that, and Aizawa continued, that said though, try not to fall asleep up here or stay up too late if you can help it. And obviously don't miss class again, because the next time it happens you will be getting detention. Understood? The kid nodded and they both got up, Aizawa fondly ruffling his bedhead, and while the kid really did have a horrible bedhead before walking back down to the door of Izuku's dorm. Now, get dressed, have something to eat, and get back to class. If you hurry, you should be able to make it in time for heroics. And make sure to get whatever notes you missed from someone. I'm sure that either Ida or Uraraka would be happy to give you theirs. Yes, Sensei. I'm sorry again for all the trouble. The kid bowed before shuffling back into his room and closing the door. As he walked away from the dorms, Aizawa relaxed a bit. He could understand the kid needing some peace and quiet. Hell, the pro could hardly deal with the class during the school day, always running out of energy by the time classes were over. He couldn't imagine the noise following him back home. As long as the kid wasn't in any danger, wasn't in that dark place that Aizawa himself knew all too well, he could go up on the roof as much as he wanted. Izuku was going home for the weekend. He wasn't going to at first, but then his mom decided to go out of town for a few days with friends and wanted him to house sit for her. He had jumped at the opportunity, some true peace and quiet, the ability to be completely alone with his thoughts, comfortable, and without having to make conversation or talk. Sign him up. His mom was leaving Friday night and he was going to take the train home the following morning. He could hardly wait. He had gotten all of his assignments done, filled out the appropriate sign-out forms, and was overall just ready for the silence and familiarity of his apartment. Sure, the dorms were a second home to him, and he really enjoyed living with all his friends, but he had lived in the apartment for years. It was his childhood home and there was something about it that would always be special. Izuku was in a great mood when his alarm went off. Not necessarily a rare thing, but not exactly common either. He planned to go home, clean the apartment, maybe go on a run and then bake something. Most people wouldn't pin Izuku as a baker. Hell, most people were surprised that he could even enter a kitchen without setting something on fire, but it was calming and something that he and his mom had always enjoyed doing. Eventually he began to enjoy baking by himself more than he enjoyed it with her, but that wasn't to say he disliked baking with his mom. It was just more peaceful when it was only him. And it had been such a long time since he was able to clean and bake the way he wanted without anyone else in his space. Most people saw cleaning as an annoying chore, one that would go by faster with more people, but on the right day Izuku actually rather enjoyed the monotonous tasks of wiping down counters, vacuuming and doing the dishes. It was peaceful. And if no one was around to push in his space or try to offer assistance, then he could really make sure everything was done exactly the way he wanted. There would be no one to mention that he had vacuumed that spot 3 times, no one to mention that he has reorganized his notebooks enough times that they actually ended up exactly the way they had been in the first place. And he could put his earbuds in, singing along to whatever song on repeat without bothering anyone, or having to take the earbuds out for a conversation. Cammy, it sounded so stupid to be this excited to clean his own goddamn apartment, but nonetheless Izuku was in a good mood. He didn't spend much time lying in bed but wasn't in a huge rush either. Just a steady meandering pace as he got dressed and washed up for the day. He made himself a bagel with cream cheese and nodded hello to Ida before heading out to catch the train. He'd managed to avoid talking the whole morning by leaving early and pretending not to be fully awake yet. If all went well, he wouldn't have to talk at all the whole day. Once he got to his apartment, Izuku shuffled out of his shoes and set his bag down before doing a brief walkthrough of the place to see what he was working with. His mom had done the dishes before leaving, and nothing was exactly out of place, but there was certainly work to be done. The floors were dusty, the countertops needed cleaning, and frankly Izuku was going to re-clean and reorganize most of the apartment again anyway, even if no one but him could tell that it was needed. So, he put his earbuds in, pulled his slightly grown-out hair into a weird little ponytail and set to work. He hummed and sang as he tidied, not loud enough to annoy the neighbors, but loud enough to fill his own head with the sound. It was nice. It took a few hours to get everything cleaned exactly the way he wanted, but right before he got changed for his run, he decided to also toss the sheets in the wash. Might as well. And despite the fact that he knew his mom had washed them since the last time he'd been over, he couldn't get over the feeling that they were dirty somehow, and the thought of sleeping on them that night made him want to take an extra shower. Once that was done, he grabbed an energy bar to snack on before heading out for a run. It had been a while since he last ran this particular route, and it was nice to fall back into the old rhythm of streets and people. He ran all the way down to the beach, where his mood was dampened ever so slightly at the sight of some trash carelessly tossed about. Nothing more than a few plastic water bottles and soda cans, but after having spent months cleaning the beach top to bottom, it was disheartening to see trash at all. He picked up everything he saw and threw it away on his way back to the apartment. As soon as he got inside, he washed his hands again, scrubbing for good measure. Trash from outside always felt grosser than trash from inside. He also switched his sheets into the dryer. He decided to make some ramen for lunch before baking, adding 2 hard-boiled eggs and some fried ham for some protein, before retidying and scrolling through his phone for a good recipe. He settled on a brownie recipe that he practically knew by heart and double-checked that he had all the ingredients. The baking didn't take long, and soon he was seated in front of the TV taking notes on a hero fight from the news while he nibbled on the sweets. He texted with his friends a bit later in the afternoon, and they all decided to go to the mall the next day. Izuku didn't particularly love malls, not after the incident with Shigaraki, but he decided that it would be fine. Not too long after his plans for the next day were decided, Izuku ordered some takeout for dinner, not in the mood to re-dirty any dishes. The day had been just as good as he had hoped, and he was still in a good mood when he got ready for and made his bed. However, this did not stop his brain from adding self-harm to his list of things to do as he finished putting on his PJs. It was stupid. It was so stupid, and he had no reason for the urge, but it was there nonetheless. He wanted to chase that hazy, faraway feeling. He had felt something similar to it all day, and it was so nice, and he wanted to feel it more. Rather than setting up on the floor like he normally would, however, he decided to take a bath instead. The first time he had ever cut had been in the winter, and so he often cut in the shower or the bath to keep the chill away while he had his skin exposed. It wasn't cold now, but after all the cleaning that day, his crooked hands were feeling more than a little sore, and the idea of a bath was nice. After all, he needed his hands to be steady to hold the blade. So, with that in mind, he set about to making a mug of tea, running the water with a little bit of bubble bath, and lighting a lilac candle. He also grabbed his small and admittedly shitty speaker from his room because he didn't want to risk his earbuds getting wet. He turned down the lights in the bathroom and then went to the drawer in his room that held his sewing supplies. Like his drawer at the dorms, this one also held 2 boxes of pins, one of which contained a small array of razors. Once everything was set, he settled into the warm water with a sigh and allowed himself to just sit there for a while, occasionally sipping his tea. After all, there was no rush to this. No one was home, he didn't have anything else to think about doing, and this was just meant to be a little meditation before bed. After several minutes, the ache in his hands subsided with the warmth, and he picked up one of the blades he had set on the side of the tub. He ended up having to sit on the side of the tub himself, just resting his feet in the water so that he could reach the places he wanted to cut without them being distorted by water and soap bubbles. He made sure to put a towel down so that water wouldn't end up all over the floor and dug the razor into his inner thigh. Blood pooled out of the cuts more easily with how damp his skin was, and he watched as it dripped into the water below. He ended up cutting a little deeper than he had really meant to, littering his hips, thighs, ankles, and ribs with cuts. Normally he'd stick to 1 or 2 places per session, but something in him zoned out in a way it hadn't in a while, and he found himself continuing again and again. The water didn't turn pink at first, instead it gained an almost yellow tinge before it began to inch towards pink. The bubbles had long since disappeared and the floaty feeling was in full swing. In fact, Izuku felt further away than he had in ages. He couldn't even hear the music that he had set up and had no idea how much time passed. Eventually he sank back into the water and stared up at the ceiling for who knows how long. It was so nice, but in the back of his mind he realized that he had gone deeper and left more cuts than he maybe ever had, and that the bath water would keep the cuts from clotting how they normally would. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he realized that this was perhaps more dangerous than he had intended, but he could hardly bring himself to care. This entire day was what he had needed so badly recently, and if he was beginning to feel slightly hazy from heat and blood loss, then maybe that was okay. It wasn't like he was gonna die. Eventually, he tuned back into his music just enough to register that his playlist was repeating itself. He must have been lying in the bath for almost 2 hours then. The water wasn't cold, but it had certainly cooled off and it was probably time to get out. His vision clouded over with black and silver dots when he tried to stand, and as he leaned against the wall, blaming the dizziness on the heat of the bath, he reveled in how the lightheadedness brought him that much further away from the world. He drained the bath as he dried off with a dark blue towel. No use in possibly staining one of their lighter ones. The cuts, definitely a bit deeper than normal, slowed to a sluggish bleed as he patted them dry and pulled his PJs back on. He blew out the candle, set his mug in the sink and collapsed into bed, warm, happy, and far away. Izuku felt decidedly less nice when he woke up. Every place that he had cut was sore and seemed to be rubbing the wrong way against his clothes. He was still a little dizzy and a little nauseous too. He was very glad that no one was meeting at the mall until after lunch, because he just wanted to roll right back over and go to sleep again. And once he set a new alarm, that's exactly what he did. Waking up the second time wasn't any better. The sun was too bright, and his throat was scratchy. It was, however, really time to get up. So, after staring at his ceiling for maybe a little too long, Izuku rolled out of bed with a groan. The cuts from last night must have stuck to his clothes because the moment he went to stretch, all of them seemed to pull in a very unpleasant way. His theory was confirmed when he went to change and had to cringe as he ripped the fabric away from new scabs. He ended up just changing into a different, clean pair of sweats and a t-shirt, tossing a hoodie in his bag in case the stores at the malls were air-conditioned. He examined the cuts from the night before in the mirror briefly and noted that they were definitely worse than he had realized or intended. He probably should have wrapped them, honestly 1 or 2 might have needed stitches, but they had already scabbed over for the most part and he didn't have the energy to do it now. He didn't have much of an appetite either, and the thought of food actually made him feel rather ill. Sometimes it was just like that. He didn't think it had anything to do with feeling dizzy last night, but just in case he forced himself to drink a Gatorade. Electrolytes would be good if he was dehydrated, but the sweetness of the drink made him want to gag a little bit. Honestly, he simultaneously was dreading and looking forward to the mall. He wasn't feeling up to talking much, but the silence in his head had gotten too loud and he wanted something to fill it. Maybe he'd be able to disappear at the back of the class and just listen to them talk without having to add anything himself. Maybe he'd get to hold onto someone's hand or lean against someone while they browsed the stores. Feel someone real and warm next to him. The thought of talking was unpleasant, but physical contact sounded great. He wanted a hug, but more than that he wanted prolonged contact. Cuddling or holding hands or something. Physical contact was one of his main love languages, and while he got a decent amount of it, it had still been longer than he liked since he had more than a brief hug. He really just wanted to cling to someone and never let go, and he hoped that he'd at least get something close to that today. That hope was one of the main reasons he managed to shove his wallet in his bag and drag himself out of the apartment when the time came. The mall was just as loud and crowded as he remembered it being, but it wasn't hard to pick out his friends. He was a bit surprised to see Shinso there. The boy seemed to dislike the mall almost as much as he did, albeit for different reasons. He waved to everyone when they saw him and received a brief hug from both Ida and Uraraka, which was nice. He was unfortunately not able to avoid conversation, and every word seemed to grate against his throat and mind. It almost made him want to cry or choke and cough, because it felt so wrong to be talking when the silence was so loud, but he plastered a smile on and powered through it. The silence had been so nice the day before. He had been craving it, and it had swaddled him like a blanket, but now it was choking and strangling him, and as much as he wanted to fill it, doing it with his own words was borderline painful. Shinso seemed to somewhat notice his discomfort and ended up linking his pinky with Izuku's, which he was surprised by but eternally grateful for. The taller boy had been somewhat standoffish when he first joined the class, but the two had bonded over sleepless nights and admittedly dark humor. Everyone else in the class seemed distinctly off-put by dark jokes coming out of Izuku's mouth, but Shinso found it hilarious. It was nice. What was also nice was that Shinso didn't push for conversation and eventually managed to tug Izuku to the back of the group, where it was quieter. After a few hours mindlessly walking around shops without actually buying anything, Izuku was feeling a little worse for wear. His vision was dipping in and out, as was his hearing. And eventually, rather than just fading back to normal, his vision faded out completely, and the next thing he knew he was half on the ground and half caught in Shinso's arms, blinking blearily up at the ceiling. Dude, Midoriya. Are you okay? Can you hear me? Shinso looked worried. Boy, I think I'm okay. Just a little dizzy. Izuku tried to stand up again, having not fallen all the way to the ground in the first place, but Shinso tugged him the rest of the way to the floor instead. Oh no, you don't, you just passed out. I literally caught you. You are not getting right back up, you fucking idiot. Are you okay? Are you sick or something? There was still cotton in Izuku's ears, but he could hear the worry in Shinso's voice nonetheless. He hated it. Why did people have to worry about him? Why did people have to think about him? Just think about something else. That said though, lying in Shinso's lap was certainly nice. I'm okay really. I wasn't hungry this morning, so I haven't eaten much today, and I didn't sleep well last night. I guess when you add those two together, I ended up getting dizzy. I'm okay though, I promise. It was only a half lie, really, but Shinso didn't look convinced. Eventually though, he sighed and shifted to help Izuku up. As soon as he started to stand, however, a few things happened. Firstly, he noticed that there were multiple people, both his friends and strangers, staring at him. Secondly, he realized that some of the cuts on his ribs were stinging something fierce, possibly reopened. His cuts hardly ever reopened unless he scrubbed them too hard in the shower or itched them as they healed because they were always so shallow. So, it was odd that they were stinging like that. Thirdly, he immediately started to black out again, and though he didn't fully lose consciousness, he ended up being scooped up bridal style by Shinso. While he complained and lit up bright red from the new position, he had to admit that it was nice being pressed up against his friend's chest, able to feel his heartbeat. After all, he had been craving physical contact, and for some reason the fact that it was coming from Shinso seemed to be a bonus. But that aside, everyone seemed extra worried now, and wasn't that just great? No one seemed to worry when he had to figure out how to not break his own bones practically on his own, but pass out at the mall? Now you're the center of attention. After a series of stuttered apologies and attempts to quell his classmates' worries, it was made clear that he wasn't going to be set down anytime soon. That said, however, Uraraka did help Shinso shift Izuku from his arms onto his back because it was more convenient. As the shift happened, Izuku was hit with a wave of tiredness and found himself nuzzled into the back of his friend's neck, breathing in the smell of his shampoo. Some sort of miscellaneous floral scent. Eventually, despite Izuku's insistence that he was fine, it was decided that Shinso would bring him home so that he could rest. Everyone else decided to stay at the mall a while longer, and so the two waved and said goodbyes before walking to the train station. Izuku was still settled on Shinso's back, and every time he remembered that fact, he blushed a little, blaming it on the slight dizziness that had yet to fade. He still tried a few times to convince Shinso that he was fine to walk, but he got shot down every time. He knew that his sleepy instance wasn't all that convincing, and frankly he didn't really want to get down and leave the warm comfort of his friend's back. He did feel bad that Shinso was carrying him as well as his bag, though. At least Shinso had come to the mall empty-handed, so he didn't have to worry about carrying two bags. Shinso set him down on the train, finding an open seat for Izuku, but not managing one for himself. Izuku wasn't too happy about the loss of contact, and was even less happy when he noticed the tiniest specks on blood that were soaking through his shirt. It wasn't noticeable in the slightest, but nonetheless he felt panic begin to rise in his chest until he remembered his sweatshirt. He wasn't really cold but pulled it on nonetheless just to be safe. He resisted the urge to glance at Shinso's back, because really there wasn't nearly enough blood to have gotten through 2 layers of fabric. He was still paranoid though. Shinso seemed to read this discomfort as what it had been earlier, and he slipped a hand into Izuku's curls, keeping the other on the handrail. If Izuku hadn't been so surprised by the action in the first place, he might have noticed the slight blush on his friend's face, but instead he was just focused on the hand that was carting its way through his hair. It was nice and helped to calm the silence that was still roaring in Izuku's ears. The train ride home seemed to take less time than usual, and once the train stopped, Shinso knelt down in front of Izuku again and he begrudgingly climbed back on. The two didn't talk on the way back to Izuku's apartment, and eventually Izuku was let down to dig out his keys and unlock the door. "Is your mom home?" Shinso said as he shuffled out of his shoes and looked around. Izuku faintly remembered that the boy had never actually been here before. "No, she's out of town. I'm just house-sitting for her. I'll come back here again after school tomorrow and then she'll be home Tuesday night." It was unusual for her to be able to take so many days of off work, and Izuku was glad that she was taking the time to visit with some of her friends. She hardly ever saw them anymore. "I see." The two stood awkwardly by the door for a few moments before Izuku broke the silence. I made brownies yesterday? If you want to come in and have one, that is. I totally get if you just want to leave. I mean, it was probably a big hassle for you to bring me here anyway and dash. Dude, I'd have to be some kind of crazy person to turn down free brownies." Izuku nodded and guided him towards the kitchen, offering to make coffee on the way. Shinso nodded at that and sat down by the kitchen counter while Izuku pulled out 2 mugs. He made tea for himself, not being much of a coffee fan, and set the drinks next to Shinso while he cut the brownie. "These are really good. I didn't know you could bake. Are you not having any?" No, I'm not really hungry. I was just gonna have the tea." Shinso raised an eyebrow at that, looking a disturbing amount like Mr. Aizawa in the process. "Midoriya, you literally passed out today because you hadn't eaten anything?" Izuku at least looked a little sheepish at that, even though he knew a lack of food wasn't the only reason he'd passed out. He had been dizzy since the night before. "I know, but I'm just not hungry. I'll make something for dinner later." "Somehow, I don't believe you." Izuku rolled his eyes and took a sip of his tea to avoid the conversation. Shinso, however, was not having it. "You aren't denying it. Come on, just have something small or I'm gonna keep bothering you." The back and forth continued a little while longer until Izuku gave in and got himself some of the leftover takeout from the night before. The idea of sweet things was even less appealing than everything else at the moment. The two teens ate in silence and continued to sit at the table for a few minutes after they were done before Shinso decided that he should probably head home. Izuku didn't really want him to leave, because even though they weren't talking, he was still keeping the silence at bay. He didn't say that, however, and bid his friend farewell before putting their dishes in the sink. He wasn't up to cleaning them. He tried to just go to bed once Shinso left, but everything was too loud. The quiet was making him panic and he just needed to calm down. He tried listening to music, but somehow that made everything worse, as did turning on the TV. Everything was too much and too little all at once, and Izuku wanted to cry, but instead he turned on the shower. The noise wasn't great, but he really didn't have the energy to run a bath, so he grabbed his PJs and slipped into the water. The drumming of the shower wasn't enough to calm him down, and he just needed something, anything to calm him down, to ground him. He was scratching at his arms and hardly breathing, but nothing was working. He wanted that faraway feeling from the night before. He needed it, just enough to fall asleep and forget the silence. Forget the noise. He didn't even turn off the shower, and he wrapped a towel around himself and stumbled to his room to grab his razors. His hands were shaking by the time he got back in the shower, sitting on the floor and adjusting to slide the blade across his hip. There was hardly any room to, but he managed to slip the blade in the few gaps left from the night before. Soon though, he got frustrated because it wasn't enough. He just wanted to have that meditative feeling, and this wasn't working. He tried the same tactic everywhere else from the night before and ended up adding cuts to his ankles too. Eventually he noticed that he had a slice on each hand too. When had that happened? He always tried not to cut on his hands. So why was there a slice on each one? His frustration kept building and he ended up ripping at the scabs with his nails, just wanting something to ground him. It hurt, but the pain wasn't bringing him back down to earth or sending him to his floaty place. He was stuck somewhere in the middle, panicking but unable to cry and just get the feeling out. The water around him was swirling pink and he tried to focus on that, but it just wasn't helping. He tried shoving his fingers down his throat to gag the feeling out, but he hadn't eaten enough that day to bring anything other than a mouthful of bile up. It didn't help. Eventually he grabbed the razor again and dug it into his skin with shaking hands. There was more blood than he had been expecting. He had been trying to focus on the pink water earlier, so why did it seem like there was so much more now? The bathroom was hot, and the steam made it even harder to breathe, but he didn't want to get out. The cuts were stinging and aching deep in his bones, which didn't make any sense. He was never able to cut deeper than surface level. So why did it hurt so much? Then again, at the same time that it was hurting, his body was starting to feel heavy and numb, and oh no. No, this wasn't what he meant to do. He didn't mean to go this far, but he had wanted to just make the feeling go away and it wasn't working. This was supposed to help calm him down, but instead everything was so much worse, and he couldn't breathe. Izuku always cut horizontally or in places with lots of fat and muscle to cover any risky arteries. He never cut his wrists and was always careful about how he cut because he knew he wasn't trying to kill himself. But, in his panic he must have gone too deep or been sloppy with the razor and slipped from horizontal to something diagonal or vertical. He knew that there were arteries near his inner thighs, but he had never meant to cut deep enough for that to matter. And now he was panicking on the floor of his shower because he knew what serious blood loss felt like, and he was already in bad shape from the night before and no one was home. His mom was out of town, and he was alone at his apartment, bleeding out in the shower, and this wasn't what was supposed to happen. This was so much worse than the silence that had been eating at him all day, and he didn't know what to do because his vision was blurring and everything felt like it was crushing him. Water. Shut off the water, let the cuts clot. Dry off. Drink something. Izuku tried to pull himself up to turn off the water but stumbled and smacked his head into the shower wall. There was blood everywhere, the ribbons of red and pink were not soothing like they normally were, but he managed to turn off the water and stumble out of the tub. He grabbed his towel and tried to dry off, but he kept fumbling and it wasn't slowing the bleeding by much. He needed to call someone. His phone was in his room, or was it still in the kitchen? He tugged on his boxers, wincing at the feel of the fabric, but he was failing miserably at applying pressure with the towel, and maybe this would help somehow. He pulled on a hoodie too because now that he was out of the shower, he realized how cold he was getting. He left bloody footprints all the way to his room, and then back to the kitchen counter when he realized his phone was out there and not on his bed. He sank to the floor and stared at his phone. Who was he supposed to call? His vision was blurring at the edges, and he could barely make out his list of contacts. His mom was out of town, so he couldn't call her. He didn't want to go to the hospital, so the police were out of the question, and he didn't really want to tell Auntie Mitsuki what was happening even though she lived nearby. Recovery Girl had said that she wasn't healing any self-inflicted injuries, and though this was a bit different than what she meant, his oxygen-deprived brain decided that she wasn't an option. That left his classmates, who he really didn't want to bother, All Might, whose noisy personality was the last thing he wanted right then, and Mr. Aizawa. He must have dialed Mr. Aizawa because the next thing he knew the phone was ringing and it was so quiet but too loud all the same. Midoriya? Is something wrong? Mr. Aizawa sounded worried. Izuku briefly wondered what time it was. It was dark outside. He hoped he wasn't interrupting what little sleep his teacher got. I did something. I didn't mean to. I'm sorry, please don't be mad. I'm sorry, it's just, and it was so much, and I didn't think it'd go that far and I don't dash. He could hardly breathe and everything felt heavy. Like something was crushing his chest and lungs. He was hardly even holding onto his phone. Midoriya, listen. I need you to calm down and tell me what's going on. Can you do that for me? Izuku choked on a sob and put his head in between his knees, pressing his eyes shut. The whole room was spinning and blurry. I can't, I'm sorry, I really didn't mean to, but I didn't know who else to call. Please don't be mad. I'm not mad, Midoriya. I promise, just tell me what's wrong. Can you do that? Izuku wasn't sure when he'd started crying, but now he couldn't stop, and he could barely tell what his teacher was saying anymore. He wished he hadn't called because even though he was scared, he didn't want his teacher to worry. He didn't want to go to the hospital. He didn't want anyone to find out. No one was supposed to find out, and yet here he was on the kitchen floor crying to his teacher. Midoriya, I need you to hear me? Listen to me, okay? 1, 2, 3, 4, breathe dash. Everything sounded muffled and disjointed. He was trying to breathe, but it just wasn't working. Nothing was working. He was alone in his kitchen, bleeding out on the floor because he was being stupid. He just wanted it to stop. At first, when Izuku began to wake up, it was nice. It was quiet in a way that wasn't overbearing. He felt floaty, and things were calm. Then, a too loud beeping noise made itself known, and the night's events came crashing back to him. Suddenly, everything was loud and quiet and suffocating again, and he resisted the urge to cry as he opened his eyes. It seemed like he was in the school infirmary. At least it wasn't a hospital. Izuku didn't know if he could handle waking up in the hospital. At least this room was familiar, as was the person who was sleeping in the chair next to his bed. Mr. Aizawa was slumped over the side of the bed, one hand on Izuku's knee, using his other hand as a pillow. His teacher was still asleep, and Izuku took the opportunity to glance around the room. No one else was in there, and he was hooked up to N4. He could feel bandages on his chest and legs, as well as see the ones on his hands, meaning that someone had seen and bandaged all of his cuts. Great. Sure, he was infinitely glad that he hadn't bled out and died on his kitchen floor, but he wasn't exactly overjoyed at the fact that his secret was out. He hoped that they'd believe him if he explained he hadn't meant to let it go that far. It had scared him a lot, to be honest. He very much did not want to die, and the fact that he had gotten close enough to end up in the infirmary made him want to throw up. A few minutes later, Aizawa began to stir and Izuku closed his eyes again, hoping to avoid conversation. It didn't work. I know you're awake, kid. How are you feeling? Izuku sighed and reopened his eyes to stare at the ceiling. He tried to shuffle into a more seated position before answering, but his limbs felt static and clumsy, and his teacher ended up having to help him adjust his pillows so that he could mostly sit up. He looked at his bandaged hands. What was he supposed to say in this situation? That he felt like the biggest idiot on the planet? That he was scared? That he just wanted to go back to sleep and pretend this never happened? I feel static. Wow. Such a great answer, Izuku. Yeah, that'll be the pain meds working. Do you want to talk about what happened yesterday? We don't have to right away if you don't want to, but we will have to talk about it eventually. Izuku nodded. He figured as much. They wouldn't want to risk triggering him right away by forcing him to talk, but there was no way they'd just let something like this go. Would you believe me if I said that I didn't mean to? I do remember you saying something like that last night. Aizawa was looking at him with care. There was worry mixed in for sure, but mostly it was just care. It was different than his usual deadpan expression, but not overwhelming in the same way the everything else was. Despite this, Izuku turned to look at his hands instead, fussing with the edge of his blanket. I really didn't. I mean, yeah, I meant to cut, but I didn't mean to let it get that bad. I wasn't trying to kill myself. I freaked out when I realized how much blood I was losing. He glanced back up at his teacher, who just nodded at him, leaving room for him to continue. When he didn't, his teacher started talking again. Do you want to tell me why you were cutting? Or maybe how long this has been going on? It started my first year in middle school. Aizawa's eyes widened the tiniest bit at that, but he quickly schooled his expression. It started out as a sort of release, I guess, and then it just became a habit. I'd get clean for a while, then start up again for no particular reason. It was just kinda relaxing, I guess. It sounds fucked up, I know, but it seriously was nothing more than that. It just kinda let me zone out, do something monotonous that would let me focus on something without really focusing. Eventually the whole story just tumbled out, explanations of who knew, of how sometimes everything was too loud or too quiet, of how words would get caught in his throat and he just wished that he didn't need to talk. How he hated people worrying, how he logically knew it was bad and serious, but couldn't seem to really internalize what that meant. He ended with an explanation of that weekend, leading right up to when he passed out on the phone. His teacher waited for a moment before nodding and sitting up a bit straighter. I see. I was on patrol when you called, and when you stopped responding I decided to check up on you at your house. I found you in the kitchen and brought you here. Recovery girl treated you, but you didn't have the stamina for her quirk. I stayed the night and called your mom to tell her what happened. I guess that you weren't trying to kill yourself, but we couldn't rule the possibility out and we told her as much. She's worried and understandably upset, but she won't be home until Tuesday night, so she asked if you could give her a call once you woke up. Izuku nodded but said that he didn't feel up to calling her just yet. Recovery girl came shortly after to recheck over everything and explain the extent of the injury. He'd nicked the artery on each inner thigh and paired with the blood loss and lack of food from before, had ended up needing an 4. His therapist would be informed, but they gave him an offer so that he wouldn't need to be hospitalized for observation. Based on what you explained, I don't think sitting in a mental ward in a hospital would be particularly good for you, but we can't exactly leave you alone after something like this. Izuku nodded and waited for his teacher to continue. Your mother is still out of town, and we don't want to just leave you at the dorms, but we could have you stay at the teacher's dorms instead. You'd be staying with Hizashi and I so that we can keep an eye on you for a few days and then we'd go from there. We can get Tsukachi to confirm what you said about not being suicidal. I believe you, but having him confirm it will make things easier. I think I'm okay with that. I'm really sorry for all the trouble. Kid, you don't have to apologize. I cannot explain how glad I am that you called me when you did. You can always call or talk to me if you need to, I really don't mind. You can talk to your friends too. Chitoshi's been worried about you. Shinso? Yeah, I didn't tell him, but after what happened at the mall and with me staying here the night, he made a few guesses and figured out roughly what happened. How did he know you stayed here after your patrol? Well, he's my son and he never sleeps, so when I didn't check in he noticed and asked where I was. Izuku blinked once, then twice. Shinso is your son? Aizawa chuckled at Izuku's bewildered expression before explaining. Yeah, Hizashi and I adopted him a little while after school started. We don't really broadcast it because we didn't want people to think I'd play favorites. Izuku snorted at that, and also it's just a bit dangerous for pros to be open about their families, even underground heroes like me. Most people don't even know that Zashi and I are married. Izuku had known that, but it was less that he'd been told and more that he put it together after a while. By the way, and you can absolutely refuse this, but Hitoshi wanted to visit you after class today if you're up for it. He won't be upset if you say no. Class? I'm missing class. You're missing class? Kid, it's fine. You can get the notes from someone later and your teachers will give you extensions if you need them. As for me, I'm happy to be missing class with those hellions. I got Nemuri to cover for me. Yeah, but still. And Shinso could visit if he wants. I hope he hasn't been too worried. Aizawa nodded and said that he'd let Shinso know. They continued to talk about lighter topics for a while, and Izuku had some cereal and fruit for breakfast. He couldn't have stomached anything else despite how hungry he was. Eventually Izuku drifted off again and was soon followed by his teacher, who once again slumped across the side of his bed, one hand on his knee for comfort. It was nice, and the noisy silence faded to the back of his mind. Izuku woke back up a little while before Shinso was going to visit, and he decided it was about time he gave his mom a call. He was dreading it, sure, but she deserved to know that he was okay. Mr. Aizawa moved to sit closer to the door and scrolled through his phone while Izuku made the call, giving him the semblance of privacy. The call went about as he had expected it to. She sounded absolutely heartbroken, and it was clear that she felt guilt for leaving town. He comforted her, calmed her down, and explained that the severity was the result of a panic attack as opposed to him being suicidal. That seemed to quell her worried ever so slightly, and she reminded him to book an appointment with his therapist as soon as he was ready to. The call ended after he explained that his teachers would be keeping an eye on him for a few days, and they hung up. Shinso walked through the door not 5 minutes after, a bit red-faced and with even worse eye bags than usual. Hey Midoriya. How are you feeling? Are you okay? Shinso strolled right over to the bed and sat in the chair that Mr. Aizawa had previously been occupying. Wait, was he supposed to be calling Shinso Aizawa because he was his son? That would be confusing. He never seemed to mind or correct being called Shinso, but maybe he was just being polite? Actually, never mind, Shinso didn't care about politeness. Speaking of Aizawa though, the man quietly left the room once Shinso entered, giving the two some privacy. They weren't going to leave him alone, but at least they trusted him without an adult. Hey Shinso. Yeah, I'm alright, I think. I'm sorry for worrying you. Shinso just stared at him for a moment. He was looking so intensely that Izuku started to feel a blush rise to his cheeks and decided to find interest in the frayed edge of his blanket. Don't apologize, dumbass. I'm just glad you're okay. Can I just give you a hug? I get it if physical contact isn't really your thing right now, but I'd really like a hug actually. It was true. And when Shinso carefully wrapped his arms around the smaller teen, ever mindful of his bandages, Izuku felt like the knot in his chest was loosening a bit. Kami, never apologize, okay? I was worried because you're my friend Midoriya. I care about you. Fuck, I don't know what I'd do. Izuku. What? You can call me Izuku. I feel like we might as well be on a first-name basis, right? Shinso pulled him just a little tighter, and Izuku breathed in the smell of his shampoo again. It was nice. Then you can call me Hitoshi. Izuku nodded into his friend's shoulder and neither of them moved. Eventually, Hitoshi sat back in the chair, but kept one hand on Izuku's, like he was afraid he'd disappear if he let go. The action was not unnoticed by the green-haired teen, who was beginning to resemble a strawberry. He didn't move though, very glad for the contact. I have notes for you to copy later. They're probably not as good as yours, but better than nothing, you know? Also, everyone in class knows you're in the infirmary, but they don't know why. Most of them have guessed that you're just really sick because of the whole fainting thing, but none of the teachers have said anything. It'll be up to you if you want to tell everyone the truth or not. Thanks, Toshi. I might tell you Rarika and Ida at some point. Maybe Kaken too, but I'm not sure. I think everyone would just worry a bunch, and I don't want them to act different, you know? Hitoshi nodded, then paused. If Izuku didn't know any better, he'd say the insomniac was blushing. Good thing he knew better. Toshi, the insomniac asked. And now Izuku was the one blushing. Yeah. Hitoshi, Toshi. I don't have to call you that though, it just sorta slipped out and It's fine. I like it. They both smiled then. When had Izuku gotten so comfortable with him? I mean, sure, they had been friends for a while and the whole class had been through a lot together, but Izuku was finding himself unbelievably glad that Toshi was the one who was visiting him. Sure, he loved his other friends, but the idea of seeing them right then was unappealing. He knew that Hitoshi was worried, but the boy wasn't looking at him with pity or like he was made of glass. He was looking at him like there was the world who might slip through his fingers. It made Izuku's face heat up, but it was nice. They sat in silence for a little while, but it was a good silence. Not the faraway one he chased when he cut, and not the all-oppressive one that he'd experienced yesterday. It was nice. Eventually Toshi began to fill the silence little by little, but he didn't pressure Izuku for a response. Izuku wasn't quite at the point where talking made him feel sick, but he wasn't in the most talkative mood either. And when the green-haired teen did make a very pointed joke, Toshi had the good nature to only look shocked for a second before bursting out laughing. He didn't act horrified that Izuku would make such a joke so soon, and instead the two ended up almost crying with laughter. Izuku found that he very much enjoyed the sound of Hitoshi's laugh. It was deep and rumbly and filled the room. Izuku was glad that he got to hear it, rather than having to sit and console his friend like he had with his mother. "By the way, you're gonna be staying with my dad's for a few days, right?" Izuku nodded, still getting used to the fact that one of his best friends was the son of two of his teachers. "Would it be okay if I stopped by? I have a room with them. It's probably where you'll sleep. I can show you around and stuff if you want. I get it if you just want some alone time though. It'd actually be great if you could come and hang out with me. It feels kinda weird that I'm gonna be at the teachers' dorms, so it'd be nice if you could come. Only if you want to though. I don't want to impose dash. I wouldn't have offered if I didn't want to, dumbass." "Oh, right. Thanks then." Recovery Girl came in a little while later and brought Izuku some more food while he rechecked that he was doing alright. He had enough stamina for her to heal him a little bit, but he quickly fell asleep again after. Toshi stayed with him until he fell asleep, and Aizawa re-entered the room. He gave Hitoshi a side hug and some comfort now that the green-haired boy wasn't awake to see it and feel bad. Hitoshi ended up going for a full hug instead and wiped his tears on his dad's shirt. The two stood like that for a while. Seeing Izuku lay in the hospital bed for the reasons he was, hit a little too close to home for each of them. The other teachers at the dorms were informed of the situation with Izuku prior to him showing up, but they were thankfully polite enough not to act differently around him. They just smiled at him or said a quick hello as he trailed behind Aizawa. Izuku wasn't sure if he'd be able to handle looks of concern or pity. Those looks were why he kept this all to himself in the first place. He hated that people worried so much, especially when he didn't feel like his habits were all that bad. He understood why they were worried, he really did, he just wished they wouldn't be. Izuku knew that if any of his friends did what he did, he would try his best to help them, to talk them out of it, to get them to stop. He knew that he would worry. But he still didn't like it when people did the same for him. He knew that it made no sense, but he really didn't feel like it was that bad. He wasn't depressed. I mean, sure, he had some anxiety, but who wouldn't after his life? Sometimes he felt sort of silly for cutting. His life was stressful sometimes, sure, but all in all it was good. Sometimes he felt like he didn't deserve to cut, which wasn't that a strange thought. He felt like cutting was a lollipop after getting a shot at the doctor, except that he hadn't actually gotten a shot. And wasn't that a disturbing comparison? Cutting and a lollipop? Those two things shouldn't line up. His life was good, and sometimes he genuinely cut for no reason. He felt like he was faking it somehow. Like he was somehow being disrespectful to people who were actually struggling. It was stupid, Izuku knew that, but still. He knew he needed help, that he probably was struggling, but he wasn't struggling with sadness or depression or even anger, so it didn't feel real. It was a strange thing to know that he needed help, but at the same time to feel like he wasn't struggling. Illogical, as Aizawa would say. Speaking of Aizawa, the man was leading Izuku up to his room. Hitoshi would bring him an overnight bag when he came by after dinner. Izuku wanted to avoid seeing his friends because he knew that they would worry and ask questions, and he just didn't have it in him to talk to them. At some point talking and begun to be sickening again, and it was all he could manage to give hums and grunts in response to those around him. Thankfully, his teacher didn't seem to mind, and a somewhat comfortable silence had formed between them on the walk to the teachers' dorms. The silence was broken when they got to Aizawa's dorm. The teachers' dorms were more like apartments than dorms, really. Each floor was split between two teachers, and each dorm had several rooms, a kitchen, bathroom, living/dining room, and a bedroom. Seeing as Aizawa and present Mike were married, the two shared one floor with a slightly different layout. There were two bedrooms, a bathroom with a separate bath and shower room. There was a kitchen that was connected to a living room with a couch and TV. There were also two comfortable-looking armchairs and a beanbag. A small dining room table was on the far side of this main area. There was a closet by the door and a small study/office room. It was nice and homey. There were mismatched throw blankets on the couch, a few cat toys laying around, and just a general sense of comfort. Izuku noticed a number of fidget toys and a pair of noise-canceling headphones on a coffee table in front of the couch as well. You'll be staying in Hitoshi's room, his is the one on the left. We have a cat named Concrete who'll probably come to bother you at some point. Oh wait, you're not allergic to cats, are you? I should have asked earlier. Izuku shook his head and smiled. He loved cats and remembered seeing pictures of Hitoshi's cat on multiple occasions. Aizawa's cat. Present Mike's cat? It was still a little weird learning that they were Hitoshi's parents, though he can't say he was surprised they were married. It might seem odd at first glance, but Izuku had seen the was his teachers acted around each other. Light-hearted banter was a good way to put it. Their personalities complemented each other. Then Izuku remembered. Where? He paused, not liking the feeling of words in his mouth, but trying his best to shrug it off. Where's Present Mike? He's doing some work at the radio station, but he'll be back soon. And you can call him Hizashi or Yamada while we're out of class, kid? Izuku nodded, then shuffled his feet around awkwardly. He wasn't really sure what to do. There was still a little time before they'd probably have dinner, and he felt out of place. Was he supposed to go to Hitoshi's room? Somehow that felt like invading his friend's privacy. Sit on the couch? Still felt weird somehow. This was his teacher's apartment. Kid, relax. I know this is a little weird, but you'll be here for a few days, so try to make yourself at home. Chill on the couch, put on a movie or whatever. You're welcome to anything in the fridge unless it has someone's name on it, and ask if you need help with anything. If Zashi or I are in our room, just knock before coming in, but aside from that you've got free reign as long as you don't break anything. Tsukachi will come by after his shift is done to ask you some stuff. I'm gonna get some grading done, so just try to relax, okay? I know this is weird. Izuku nodded again, still a little uncomfortable, and went to sit on the couch. He turned the TV on and ended up watching some random nature documentary. His teacher sat in one of the armchairs grading papers as Izuku tried to relax. Eventually, he felt a weight appear next to him and looked down to find a rather fluffy-looking cat staring at him. The cat was exactly like he had seen in the pictures, medium-length fur, gray, thus the name, and with yellow-green eyes. She was cute. And she was also curling up in his lap before he could even register it. The wait was welcome, and he carefully pet her fur after she settled. She began purring almost immediately and Izuku's heart melted. I see you're stuck. He looked up at his teacher. You can't move if there's a cat on you. It's the law. She's trapped you? Izuku huffed a laugh at how deadpan his teacher sounded before turning back to the documentary, feeling significantly more relaxed with Concrete purring away on his lap. He didn't really pay attention to the documentary though. Instead, he really started to think about what had happened. It was weird, he always felt like his self-destructive tendencies weren't all that bad. He wasn't suicidal, and nothing he did would cause any sort of permanent damage aside from scars. He had always been so safe about it, keeping the cuts clean, stopping the habits like vomiting that could cause lasting issues. He had always been careful not to let it go too far, even as much as he thought about it. But that had changed yesterday. He had almost killed himself. On accident, sure, but still. The thought scared him. What if Aizawa hadn't picked up? Hadn't gotten there in time? What if he had passed out sooner? The thought made him shiver. But even as he felt the fear grip him, he couldn't help but think about the nice faraway feeling he had gotten the night before the mall. The feeling he always chased with the cutting. But he couldn't do that anymore. He was sure that they'd really take away his blades this time. He didn't blame them, but he wasn't sure what he'd do if the itch came back. He didn't want to resort to scratching, that almost never helped the feeling go away. He wasn't sure what he'd do. If he couldn't do anything to get rid of the feeling, it wouldn't go away. He'd tried when he first told his therapist and mom. Cutting would remain on his to-do list no matter how long he waited or how good he felt. Nothing else seemed to be able to make the urge go away. None of his other coping mechanisms worked. He'd just think about hurting himself all hours of every day until he did, and only then would the itch subside. Izuku really didn't know what he was gonna do. He knew that there was no way he'd get away with cutting again now, but maybe he could just deal with the urge until they loosened up and weren't watching as closely? He wouldn't be able to do it anymore at all. Not after such a close call. He would be too scared, too freaked out. It wouldn't be the same meditation as it had been before. But he knew that the urge would still be there, no matter how scared of it he was. He really didn't know what he was going to do. Izuku was pulled from his thoughts when his teacher told him dinner was ready. When had he gotten up? Now that he was out of his head, Izuku could smell something nice, but when on earth has his teacher made food? Or was it delivered? Izuku wasn't sure. When he didn't respond, Aizawa looked over to the couch. Izuku glanced down at Concrete, who was still on his lap, then at Aizawa, feeling a bit unsure of what to do. I'll feed her and she'll come right over. Izuku nodded and stood up once Concrete had all but launched herself off of his lap. He walked into the kitchen where his teacher gave him a bowl of soup with udon. It smelled good and he sat next to his teacher at the kitchen counter to eat. It was warm and nice. Good? Contrary to popular belief, I can, in fact, cook. Zashi's better at it, but at least I don't make as much of a mess as he does. Izuku snorted and continued to eat the soup. It didn't seem like his teacher was looking for a response, and he was glad. They ate in silence for a while after that, and when they were done, Aizawa put their bowls in the dishwasher before tuning to Izuku again. Tsukachi will be here in about 2 hours, and Hitoshi will probably be here a while before then. Zashi will probably be over a little while after Tsukachi, alright? He's gonna ask you some questions, but if it gets hard to answer them, don't feel bad. It'll probably be a lot and uncomfortable, but don't push yourself too hard, okay, problem child. His teacher fixed him with a stern glare, but there was no anger behind it. No pity either. Izuku nodded. In all honesty, he didn't think it'd be too hard to talk to the detective. He had stuff like this, sure, but he had talked about it before. Hell, he talked through the whole story with Aizawa earlier that day. He understood why his teacher might be worried about the interview, but he'd be fine. Though, the more he thought about it, the less sure he was. Izuku didn't think he had any specific triggers, but every time he had told someone in the past, the urge had gotten worse. A mix of guilt and embarrassment would push him further than usual. He had no way to cut here. He was sure that any and all sharp things were locked up before he even arrived, but the urge would probably still come. He hoped he would be able to stay calm enough not to scratch. He didn't think that his teacher would be too pleased if he did. I'm home. Izuku was once again sitting on the couch with Concrete when Hitoshi walked in, but the cat quickly abandoned him to go greet the other team. Hey Toshi. After dinner, talking had become manageable again, though he hadn't actually said anything until just then. I got your stuff, I'll put it in my room. Hitoshi slipped off his shoes and walked past the couch before turning around with a raised eyebrow. You comin'? Oh yeah. Izuku scrambled up and followed his friend to his room. He still hadn't actually entered to room, wanting to wait until Hitoshi was there so that he wouldn't invade the space or touch something he wasn't supposed to on accident. The room was a little messy, with paper strewn across the desk and some books stacked on the floor next to a bookshelf, which appeared to be full. The bed was unmade and there were several empty energy drinks on the bedside table. There was a dresser against the far wall and a closet as well. The walls had various sketches pinned up, and there was a small gay pride flag pinned above the bed. Oh shit, I forgot how messy it is in here. Just ignore that. Give me a sec. Hitoshi was bright red, and he hurriedly set both his and Izuku's bags down, before quickly tidying the room despite Izuku's promises that it was fine and he didn't care. It was true, he didn't care if other people's space was messy. It only mattered if it was his space. Even so, Hitoshi insisted on cleaning up a bit, and he also changed the sheets for Izuku. While he waited, Izuku wandered over to the desk. The papers were drawings, as it turned out. They were all shockingly good. I didn't know you liked to draw. Hitoshi was, once again, very red. I didn't have a ton of friends growing up, so I spent a lot of time drawing and reading. They aren't that good, but, yeah. Same, but I think they're really good. Izuku smiled and picked up one of the sketches. It was obviously the view from the porch on Heights Alliance, and even though it was only a sketch, it had a good sense of life to it. Hitoshi blushed even harder, if possible, but managed to stammer out that they should do some art together sometime. It was all too easy to smile and agree. The two got to work setting up some of Izuku's things. Hitoshi had grabbed him 2 pairs of sweatpants, 2 sweatshirts, a t-shirt, his uniform, his school stuff and some toiletries. He also brought his notes from that day and said that if Izuku wasn't up for class the next day that he could copy those notes as well. Izuku thanked him, and they ended up working on their schoolwork in comfortable silence until Aizawa knocked on the door. Both boys were splayed out on the floor surrounded by an array of papers and pencils. Tsukachi just got into the building, he'll be here in a minute. Midoriya, do you want to talk to him alone or would you rather have one of us there with you? Izuku thought for a moment. I can talk to him by myself if that's all right. He wasn't sure why, but he felt like it was safe to have the conversation alone. Sure, Aizawa already knew everything, but Izuku knew it would probably be hard for his teacher to listen to it all again. He trusted Hitoshi but didn't want the other boy to worry more than he needed to. He knew that as much as both of them made sure to treat him the same, to not treat him like glass, they were still concerned. Izuku wanted to minimize their worry as best they could so he'd do the talk alone so they wouldn't have to sit through it. That's fine, you can sit in the office. He'll have to tell me the important stuff after because I'm your teacher and you're gonna be staying here a few days, but I won't listen in on the talk, alright? Izuku nodded just as there was a knock at the door. Aizawa welcomed the detective in as Izuku set down his work. Hey, if you need to stop the talk at all you can. If you need anything just let me know, okay dumbass? Sure thing, mum. Izuku rolled his eyes and Hitoshi punched him on the shoulder before they both got up and headed to the living room. Hello Midoriya, I hear we'll be talking in the office? Izuku nodded and cast a last, reassuring smile at his friend as well as his teacher before he disappeared into the office with the detective. Sorry you have to come here after your shift, Izuku said as they sat down. Nah, don't worry about it. It was a shorter day than usual anyway. Now, as you know my quirk is lie detector, I'll be able to tell if you're telling the truth or not. I'll say after each question if you were lying or not, and I may ask you to elaborate if I think you aren't telling the whole truth. If you get uncomfortable or need a break at all, just let me know. If there's something you're uncomfortable answering, just let me know and ask for clarification if you need it, alright? Okay. First, can you tell me your own words what happened this weekend? Izuku nodded and walked the detective through the story. He wasn't super detailed but made sure not to leave out anything important. I woke up and spent the day in Recovery Girl's office before coming here. The detective nodded. True. Now, are you suicidal? No. True. Can you explain to me why you feel the urge to harm yourself? Izuku had to think for a while on that one. He tried to explain the way the urge worked a few times, but none of his answers made much sense. Eventually, though, the detective said he could tell Izuku was being truthful enough, even if it was hard to put into words, and they moved on. He asked about the frequency of the cutting, about his other self-harm tendencies, about how many people knew, what help he had gotten, and if he would be safe should he be left alone. I don't know. I don't think I have the urge right now, but I feel like that'll probably change later. I'm still kinda out of it, but I feel like once I think more about what's happened, I'm gonna feel bad about everything and the urge might come back. I think I'm too scared to try cutting again, but I can't say whether or not I'd resort to scratching or something. And it'd probably still be a bad idea if I got my hands on a razor. True. Alright Midoriya, I'll talk to Eraser, but it's likely you'll stay here for a few days. I doubt they'll make you go to school if you don't feel up to it, and once you go back to your own dorm, they'll help you to get rid of all your razors. Izuku nodded, having expected as much, and the interview was over. Izuku walked back into the living room and joined Hitoshi on the couch while Aizawa joined Tsukachi in the office after affectionately ruffling Izuku's hair. Present Yamada had come in during the interview and greeted Izuku from his seat on one of the armchairs. It was a bit odd seeing his teacher out of uniform, but Izuku supposed he'd get used to it over the next couple of days. You good? Hitoshi asked. Yeah, I'm kinda tired and I might crash later, but I'm good for now. There wasn't much point in lying to Hitoshi. His friend would probably worry either way, so might as well be honest. Well, I'm glad you're good for now. You wanna hang out in here or go back to my room? Let's go to your room, I still need to finish my homework. Hitoshi groaned at that, but the two made their way back to the pile of papers regardless and got to work. Hitoshi was good at appearing calm, but Izuku had a feeling his friend was worried. He wondered if it would be good for the two of them to talk about everything a little more, but he wasn't sure. Eventually the two finished their work and went back out. To the living room. Yamada offered to make them each a mug of tea, and Izuku accepted it, while Hitoshi made a disgusted face. You aren't drinking coffee at this hour, kid? Aizawa rolled his eyes and Hitoshi stuck his tongue out at him. Izuku giggled, and he swore he saw Hitoshi's ears go pink. So, no tea and no coffee. How's hot chocolate for ya? Yamada offered. Hitoshi grumbled a bit more but accepted the compromise. He did complain again once he realized that Aizawa was drinking coffee but was eventually shut down. Once they all had their drinks, they sat in the living room. Alright kid, Tsukachi told me about your talk. We decided it's probably best if you stay here for 3 days, and then after that we'll look at things again and decide if you'll be alright back at the student dorms. We'll need to get in touch with your therapist and work out a safety plan for you as well. If you want to talk to How Dog before then you can. You don't have to go to school the next few days if you don't want to, but someone will have to stay here with you if you decide to do that. We won't have to be in the same room necessarily, but just in the apartment. You could also spend the school day in the teacher's lounge if you want. You don't have to tell your friends exactly what happened, but you should at least let them know you're okay. Izuku nodded and found himself leaning against Hitoshi once Aizawa was done. Also, listener, you don't have to talk about what happened if you don't want to, but we're here for you, alright? It's not a bother at all. We want to help any way we can. If that means distraction, then fine. If that means you need quiet company, we can do that. Izuku giggled a little at that and Yamada rolled his eyes. He was fiddling with a mini Rubik's Cube in one hand as he continued, Yeah, believe it or not I can be quiet when I want to. But like I was saying, if you need to rant or want advice or anything, just ask. Yeah. And if you feel the urge coming back, tell someone, okay, dumbass? Izuku rolled his eyes, but he could hear the sincerity in all of their voices. He had been calm the entire day, keeping his emotions in check without even meaning to. He had recounted the whole story to both Aizawa and the detective without so much as stuttering. But now? He gripped his empty mug tighter and tried to blink his tears away. Hey, what's wrong? Do you need to talk about it? Hitoshi was hovering his hands over Izuku, who was still leaning on his shoulder. Not quite touching but close. Damn it, why was he crying now? He tried to calm himself back down, he really did. But the knot in his throat wasn't having it and he turned to quietly sob into his friend's chest. Aizawa walked over and carefully took his mug to set on the coffee table. Touch, proximity, or space? He asked. He sounded gentle. Izuku thought the question was a little silly seeing as he was already curled up against Hitoshi, but he mumbled and answered anyway. Toshi? Hitoshi cautiously wrapped his arms around Izuku and held him while he cried. God, this was so embarrassing. He didn't mean to cry. Sure, he was somewhat of a crybaby, but not about stuff like this. He was good at staying calm with stuff like this, especially around other people. So why? For fuck's sake, why did he have to tell people what happened? He didn't want anyone to know. It was supposed to be a secret. No one was supposed to know and now so many people did. Izuku felt embarrassed and frustrated, and these stupid tears weren't helping. Why couldn't he ever keep this shit to himself? Why did he always have to fuck up and spill it to everyone? It was so much easier when no one knew. If they didn't know, then they wouldn't have to care. But now they knew, and they cared so much, and Izuku didn't know what to do. He felt warm and safe and was thankful that they cared so much for him, but he didn't know how to handle it. He felt like he was drowning, and he could hardly breathe as he hiccuped through his stupid tears. Care was good. Toshi was safe, Aizawa was warm, Yamada was comforting. So why did he feel like he was being crushed? He just wanted to melt into the comfort, let them help him, let himself be taken care of, but he just couldn't. Why was it so hard to just let people be there for him? Why was it so embarrassing? Why did it make knots of guilt form in his stomach? Just why? Izuku was really having trouble breathing, just barely managing to take gasping breaths between sobs. He was embarrassed and felt horrible, but he couldn't stop. Eventually everything, every thought, muddled together in his brain until he wasn't even sure what he was crying about. He was just crying. Hitoshi whispered reassurances into his hair and pulled him until he was laying on Hitoshi's chest while Hitoshi leaned back against the arm of the couch. Yamada didn't say anything as he draped a throw blanket over the two teens and carried their mugs to the kitchen. He came back a moment later, kissed the top of Hitoshi's head and asked if they wanted to be left alone or if Izuku wanted his teachers there. Izuku didn't manage much of a response, just burrowed deeper into Hitoshi's t-shirt. He wasn't even sure what his answer would be. Yamada didn't seem to mind the lack of response, and instead went to sit on the armchair behind the beanbag where Aizawa had settled. The blonde arranged himself behind his husband and hummed quietly as he braided his husband's hair. They stayed close to the two teens, but neither said anything, just allowing their student to get his emotions out. They had figured something like this was coming. Aizawa was just surprised it didn't happen sooner. Eventually, the sobs and hiccuped apologies turned to sniffles and Izuku stopped shaking. Hitoshi carded his hand through green curls while he glanced down at his friend. Izuku had cried himself to sleep. His heart ached at the sight of red cheeks and tear tracks, but he just held Izuku closer and kept mumbling meaningless reassurances. Eventually one of his dads spoke up. "Is the listener asleep?" Hitoshi nodded. "Alright, if you want to move him you can or just stay there and let him sleep," Aizawa said. His hair had been braided, unbraided, and rebraided about 1,000,000 times. Currently, his husband was halfway through a French braid. "I'll stay here. I don't want to wake him up." His dad nodded, ruining Hisashi's progress on the braid. "Do you want your phone or something? I'm not sure when he'll wake up. Maybe turn on the TV but with really low volume? Just a nature documentary or something." "Thanks, pups." Hisashi abandoned the braid and did as asked. He brought 2 glasses of water over to the coffee table in case Izuku woke up or if his son got thirsty. Then he left the 2 teens on the couch and went to get ready for bed. His husband accompanied him, and by the time they had both washed up and gone back to check on the 2, they were greeted with a sight that was equal parts adorable and upsetting. Izuku, eyes still puffy from crying, was curled up on Hitoshi who had also passed out. He was holding on to his green-haired friend tightly, even in his sleep, with one hand on the smaller boy's back and the other in his curls. Hisashi almost wanted to take a picture of the 2, but didn't want to invade like that, so instead he leaned against the wall and watched them breathe with a sad smile. I'm surprised Hitoshi fell asleep. Normally he's up for hours. He's been worried. I'm just glad they're both okay. I was worried this whole thing might trigger a relapse with Hitoshi. Hisashi hummed before responding. Me too, but he seems to be alright. We'll keep an eye on him, so don't worry. For now, he just wants to help Izuku. He wrapped his arms around his husband, who had changed into pink sweatpants and a black long-sleeved t-shirt. I know. I hope that they talk to each other. Shoyuta leaned into Hisashi's arms and breathed in. Black tea and laundry detergent filled his senses. Should we wake them up and move them to bed? Or just let them sleep? I say let the brats sleep, they need it. We can wake Hitoshi up tomorrow and decide if he's going into class or not. They can both get the notes from someone if he's not up for it. Even if this hasn't triggered a relapse, I'm sure it's draining on the kid. Maybe he can stay here with Izuku, or they can both hang out in the teacher's lounge. You're right. I wonder what they'll do when they wake up. Hisashi said as he laughed quietly, still holding his husband. So, you noticed the blushing too? Oh yeah. I wonder if either of them realizes. Who knows? They're problem children. Either way it's gonna give me a headache. Hisashi laughed again, still staying quiet, and the 2 walked back to their room, leaving the door open just in case the boys needed anything. Fuck. Izuku. It's okay. It was just a dream. You're okay, just fuck dash. Hitoshi had been woken up by a surprisingly powerful smack to the jaw and toppled to the floor with Izuku on top of him. The boy was thrashing, whimpering, and Hitoshi was simultaneously trying to wake him up and also keep him from hurting himself. Or hurting Hitoshi, for that matter. He wrapped his arms around Izuku, trying to still his failing limbs, but the boy was startlingly strong even in his sleep. Izuku, wake up, it's okay. I'm here, I've got you, you just need to wake up. A few more moments passed, and Hitoshi heard footsteps coming down the hall as Izuku finally stopped thrashing. Instead, he went completely stiff, tense, and staring with wide eyes at Hitoshi. His curls were plastered to his forehead with sweat, and he was panting like he had just run a marathon. Toshi? He said, recognition finally flashing in his eyes. Yeah, I'm here. You okay? Izuku stared down at him a few more seconds, not saying anything. Izuku? Hitoshi? You alright? We heard a crash. Hitoshi thought Izuku was going to get whiplash with how quickly his head snapped towards the hall. He immediately pulled his arms out of Hitoshi's grip, shifting into a protective position and practically snarling before he recognized Aizawa and Yamada, who were standing in the hall, looking like they had also just tumbled out of bed. They probably had. Izuku? Hitoshi asked tentatively. The boy had relaxed when he recognized his teachers but hadn't yet moved from his protective curl. His arms were braced on either side of Hitoshi's head, his legs on either side of Hitoshi's hips. One of his hands was curled behind Hitoshi's head, almost cradling it to his chest. Izuku blinked for a moment, finally taking in the entire situation, and he promptly collapsed on top of Hitoshi, nearly smothering the teen. "Kid? You okay?" Aizawa asked, slowly creeping forward. Izuku was shivering on Hitoshi's chest, so the purple-haired teen re-wrapped his arms around his friend. "Izuku? Can you hear me?" A small nod. "Do you know where you are right now?" "Teacher dorms." "Yeah. We must have fallen asleep on the couch and then you had a nightmare." "I'm sorry." No, don't apologize, okay? Just breathe for a minute. Just breathe, I'm here, and you're safe, okay? Another nod. When Shoyuta heard a loud crash from the room where his son and his student were sleeping, he had practically flown out of bed. Hizashi was less than a second behind him, and they had both rushed towards the noise to see what almost looked like a wrestling match between the two teens who had previously been on the couch. They had only just gotten to the room when one of the teens froze. Shoyuta had quietly called out, and almost flinched back in how the green-haired teen had responded. Hizashi had seen the kid fight plenty of times, but the look he had was like a cornered animal. It lasted less than a second before disappearing, and Hizashi glanced at his husband, who looked about the same as he felt. By the time they looked back at the two teens, Izuku had collapsed like a puppet with its strings cut on top of Hitoshi. His husband said something and began slowly moving forward. Hizashi followed his lead and began slowly moving into the living room. He hadn't put his hearing aids in before rushing out, and it was too dark to read lips, so he wasn't totally sure what was being said, but as he got closer, he could see his student's trembling form on top of his son. It broke his heart and he glanced towards Shoyuta to ask what had happened, a nightmare if he had to guess, but he couldn't be sure. Problem child had a nightmare. Kitten is calming him down. Go get your hearing aids, then come back. His husband signed. It was hard to make out in the dark, but he managed, nodding, then rushing back to their room. That's it, just breathe, Izuku. I gotcha. Hitoshi was rubbing gentle circles on his friend's back. Izuku had started quietly crying after collapsing, and Aizawa had knelt down next to them, carding his hand through sweaty green curls. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to, I'm so sorry dash. Didn't mean to what? Have a nightmare? It's okay, it happens. Do you want to talk about it? Izuku shook his head just as Yamada walked back into the room. Hey listener, do you want to sit back on the couch? I can make some tea if you'd like. It took a moment, but Izuku slowly nodded and let Hitoshi and Aizawa shift him onto the couch. He curled into Hitoshi's chest, still breathing hard with tears silently making their way down his face. Yamada slipped out of the room to make the tea. Did I hurt you? He asked, oh so quietly, reminding Hitoshi of his sore jaw. You hit my jaw a bit, but it's okay. Doesn't hurt all that much and the blankets broke our fall. I'm okay. Izuku mumbled out a few apologies as Hitoshi kept trying to calm him down. They started working through a few breathing exercises as Aizawa pulled a blanket around their shoulders. Yamada returned a few minutes later with 2 mugs, a jelly packet and a glass of water precariously balanced in his hands. He passed 1 mug to Izuku, the water to Hitoshi, the packet to Aizawa and kept the last mug for himself. Kids, do you get nightmares like that often? Yeah. Not always that bad, but yeah. There's not a lot I can do about it. Usually I just calm down in my room after or take a shower if I can't fall back asleep. I'm sorry that I woke all of you up. Normally I'm in my own dorm so I don't have to worry as much about waking people up. Oh kid, don't apologize. I'm glad we woke up. You shouldn't have to work through that alone. Hitoshi nodded his agreement. The thought of his friend tumbling out of bed in a panic by himself at night made his gut twist uncomfortably. It's okay, I'm used to it. That sentence did very little to quell the worries of everyone in the room, but they also understood to a degree. I know, little listener, but still. If you ever need or want help calming down after, or want to talk about it, we're here, alright. Izuku nodded and quietly sipped his tea. Lavender and chamomile with honey. Good for sleep and anxiety. He smiled, ever so slightly at the gesture. The next little while was spent in silence until each of them finished their drinks or jelly pouch. Concrete had joined them at some point, purring loudly at Izuku's side. Cats always just knew what to do, didn't they? Eventually, Aizawa suggested that they actually try to get back to sleep, seeing as it was gaining on 3 in the morning. He suggested that both boys take the day off from school to catch up on lost sleep. Izuku looked a little guilty at that, but Hitoshi assured him that he was more than glad to have an excuse to sleep in and miss school. He also mentioned that even with the nightmare, he was getting more sleep than he usually did in a night, which led to the last of Izuku's tension draining away as he scolded his friend's poor sleeping habits. He scolded Aizawa a bit as well, but the man simply rolled his eyes as he shuffled his kids into Hitoshi's room. Both teens decided to actually change into PJs, as well as brush their teeth. It helped make Izuku feel less gross to get out of his sweaty clothes, and aside from the obvious fact that he just needed to brush his teeth, he had also bitten his lip during his nightmare and wanted to get the last of the metallic blood taste out of his mouth. The tea had helped, but he still could taste the slightest bit of iron on his tongue. Hitoshi was planning on giving Izuku the bed and either going back to the couch or sleeping on the spare futon, but Izuku had quietly asked if they could both sleep in the bed. Hitoshi had short-circuited for a second, giving Kaminari and run for his money as he stared open-mouthed at his friend who had begun to stutter out an apology, before Hitoshi finally managed to spit out an agreement. Sure, they had fallen asleep on the couch together, but that was different. That said though, there was no way in hell Hitoshi was leaving his friend alone after a nightmare like that, so he crawled under the covers next to the freckled teen, who carefully curled into his chest. Hitoshi had always known Izuku was a bit of a cuddler, but he had never experienced it so plainly. High emotions must have contributed to how much the green-haired boy was seeking physical comfort, but Hitoshi didn't mind. As much as he wasn't a fan of physical contact with people, he wasn't close with, it never bothered him with Izuku. So, he just wrapped a protective arm around his friend and listened to his breathing even out. It took quite a while for him to feel sleepy again, but he occupied himself with feeling the rise and fall of his friend's chest. Eventually, he managed to drift off, lulled by the warmth next to him. It was light outside by the time Hitoshi woke up. He groaned a bit and moved to cover his eyes against the light, only to find his arms unavailable. One was tucked underneath Izuku entirely, the other trapped by the green-haired teen's arm. Hitoshi froze immediately, remembering the night before. His jaw was a little sore, and he hoped against everything he could that it wasn't bruised. He was sure that Izuku would feel horrible if it had, and he didn't want to make his friend any more upset than he had been already. Deciding not to get up quite yet, Hitoshi relaxed and tried to blink the sleep out of his eyes. He glanced down at his friend and a blush crept its way up his neck. Izuku had his head resting on Hitoshi's chest, eyes closed and sleeping peacefully. Hitoshi didn't think he's ever seen his friend so relaxed. The teen's hair was even more ruffled than usual, and Hitoshi could just barely see the freckles on his cheeks. Their legs were tangled together under the blankets, and as embarrassed as he was, Hitoshi was also immeasurably glad that Izuku was okay, safe, sleeping next to him. That said though, Hitoshi was also losing feeling in one of his arms and was halfway worried that Izuku would wake up with how fast his heart was beating. Hitoshi decided to ever so slowly try to remove himself from his friend's grip. He carefully slid his arms out from under Izuku, freezing every time he heard his friend shift or mumble in his sleep. Eventually, he managed to sit up and began to work on reclaiming his legs. It was once again a very slow process, but somehow he managed not to wake Izuku up. The teen was probably exhausted after the night before and Hitoshi wanted him to sleep as much as possible. He also wanted to avoid the inevitable awkwardness that would come if they both woke up cuddling like that. Hitoshi slipped out of his room after retucking the blankets around his green-haired friend and went to brush his teeth. Once he had washed up, he wandered to the kitchen to make some coffee. Izuku didn't really like coffee, but maybe he could make some tea as well? When he got to the kitchen, Hitoshi found a note on the counter. Hey listeners! You were still sleeping when Sho and I left for work, but there's stuff for you to make breakfast if you want. Or you could just have cereal, whatever's easiest. Just make sure you eat. You can hang out at the apartment if you want, Or you can come down to the teacher's lounge if you get bored or something. Call Sho or I if you need anything at all. We'll be back later. Zashi. Hitoshi smiled slightly at the note. He loved his dad so much. They were both so kind and thoughtful, even if they could be downright scary in the right situation. But they'd never hurt him, unless it was a spar, and they did little things like leave notes. Well, it was mostly Pops who left notes, but every so often there'd be one written in his dad's sloppy scrawl, blunt but somehow still enough to make Hitoshi smile. He had a box in his room, under his bed, where he kept every single one. He slipped this note into his pocket, planning to add it to the collection later. He decidedly ignored the embarrassment of knowing that his dads had seen he and Izuku cuddling. Hitoshi was simply not going to bother with that knowledge. He set about making coffee and tea, while also getting out bowls and cereal. He was an okay cook, but he didn't really feel like putting the effort in. He also didn't want to risk waking Izuku. He was kinda surprised that the teen wasn't already up. He always seemed to be awake at the crack of dawn going on a run or working out. The day before must have really knocked him out. Not that Hitoshi blamed him, a day like that would knock anyone out, and that wasn't even factoring in the drowsiness from Recovery Girl's quirk. It definitely made sense for Izuku to be exhausted. Honestly, despite getting more sleep than he ever did, Hitoshi was tired too. Not his normal tired, but more of a bone-deep weariness. Sue him, he was concerned for his friend. Even though he had gotten confirmation, the kind of confirmation that almost never existed in these types of situations, that his friend wasn't suicidal, he didn't feel any better about the whole thing. Hitoshi knew better than anyone not to walk on eggshells around his friend after something like this, but that didn't stop him from wanting to wrap Izuku up with blankets and tea and movies and never let him feel sad again. It was immeasurably unfortunate that he couldn't do that. Hitoshi had been in dark places before. He was no stranger to self-harm. Growing up with a villain's quirk and bigots had almost guaranteed that fact. So no, he wasn't a stranger to this sort of thing. That didn't make dealing with it any easier. When he dragged the simple version of the story out of his dad, he had hardly known how to react. He also knew that his dads were worried about him. They were subtle about it, but he had seen the extra glances cast his way during the school day, and he had noticed how his pops had left his bedroom door open while dad waited with Izuku overnight. He knew they were worried about how this would affect him. He knew, and honestly for a brief moment he had worried too. But the situations didn't seem to be the same. They didn't feel the same. Hitoshi didn't feel the urge, the hatred, that disgusting ick feeling that came with frustrated tears and shaky hands. He didn't feel it at all, which had surprised him a little bit. The closest thought he had to that was a fraction of a second worry that the urge would claw its way up his throat. But then it hadn't, and all he had to worry about was being there for his friend. Nonetheless, Hitoshi made a mental note to explain how he was feeling to his dads, and probably get a therapy appointment set up just in case. He had never been one for weekly visits, aside from right at the beginning when he first started therapy. He went by more of a need-based system. Otherwise, it just felt like an extra responsibility, an extra worry/task that made him feel overwhelmed. But Hitoshi would talk to his dads and make an appointment, just so that they wouldn't worry about him and would focus on helping Izuku. Hitoshi wondered how the green-haired ball of freckles and sunshine would be when he woke up. He'd have to figure out something to tell his other friends, for sure. He knew that Izuku had been ignoring his phone for the most part, and Hitoshi never checked his much to begin with, but he knew that the class group chat was going off the walls at his absence and the lack of explanation. It would only get worse as time went on. Hitoshi knew from experience how pushy Class 1A could be when they were worried, but he really hoped they would just accept whatever excuse Izuku felt comfortable giving them and leave it be. The other teachers knew a very brief version of the story and had thankfully not pushed the topic. They were trained in this sort of thing. Not every teacher was trained extensively, but they all had some sort of training or experience that let them know how to handle the situation. Actually, all the teachers aside from All Might had that. All Might didn't have any sort of teaching credentials, and while being a hero involved some level of knowledge for this sort of thing, Daylight heroes dealt with it far less than their underground counterparts. Hitoshi was honestly surprised that All Might hadn't rushed to Recovery Girls when he got the news, or even rushed to see Izuku last night after his meeting with Tsukachi. He had sort of expected the retired hero to show up. Hitoshi wasn't dumb, he knew that the relationship between All Might and Izuku went deeper than just student and teacher. They tried to hide it, but frankly the whole class knew. Neither All Might nor Izuku was particularly apt at keeping secrets. Hitoshi never asked about it, but that didn't mean he didn't see it. Which left him very confused when All Might hadn't checked up on Izuku at all. Maybe they weren't as close as he originally thought? Maybe the hero was just giving Izuku space and not pushing it? Who knows? Hitoshi sure didn't, but he wasn't about to ask. At some point during Hitoshi's internal debates with himself, Izuku must have woken up because he was wandering into the kitchen with a yawn. His hair was still ruffled, but it looked like Izuku had at least run his fingers through it to calm it down. His clothes were wrinkled, and he was blinking sleepily into the light of the kitchen, not fully awake. Hitoshi had seen him like this plenty of times in the dorms, but for whatever godforsaken reason, the way the morning sun lit up the boy's freckles and his sleepy smile made a blush creep its way up Hitoshi's neck. He quickly greeted his friend and handed him the tea that he had been making. Izuku accepted it gratefully with a little bit of surprise, then slumped against the counter, cradling the drink in both of his hands. His very scarred hands. Hitoshi had noticed a while ago that Izuku tended to hold onto hot drinks with both hands, or sometimes hold onto a small heat pack that he had. Hitoshi had asked about it once, getting the explanation of broken bones and chronic pain. It made sense. Izuku had shattered his bones about 1,000,000 times. That was bound to have lasting effects. Hitoshi was glad that he'd made the boy tea. I was just gonna have cereal for breakfast. You good with that, or do you want something else? Cereal sounds good, thanks Toshi. Izuku's voice was still rough from sleep and Hitoshi chose to ignore how much he liked the sound of it. He was ignoring a lot of things this morning. He got out a few options for cereal and let Izuku pick his before pouring them each a bowl. They sat in comfortable silence as they ate and sipped their drinks, content in the peace of the morning after the night before. Eventually though, they were both done eating and dishes had been put in the sink to clean later. They ended up sitting on the couch with concrete after breakfast, and eventually Hitoshi broke the blanket of silence. So, what do you want to do today? We can hang out here or go to the teacher's lounge or something. Let's go to the teacher's lounge? I don't really want to do anything, but I feel like it'd be good to get ready and leave the apartment, you know? Yeah, that works for me. Do you want to take a shower or anything? I think I'm gonna, but if you want you can go first. I probably should. And then we can go? Hitoshi nodded and got a towel for Izuku before retreating to his room to pick out an outfit. He didn't really feel like putting on his uniform, and it's not like they were going to class, so it was probably fine to forego it. Once they had both showered and gotten dressed, they grabbed backpacks and shoes before heading out of the apartment. The walk to the teacher's lounge was uneventful. Classes were already in session, so the hallways were quiet and deserted. Hitoshi and Izuku chatted a bit here and there but mostly walked in silence. Hitoshi's hair was gelled and blow-dried up into its usual style, but Izuku's hair was still damp from his shower. He refused to keep drying it no matter how much Hitoshi tried to convince him that he should. In the end he just gave up, telling the green-haired idiot not to complain when he got sick. To which Izuku had said that cold and damp don't really make you sick, they just can make it easier for viruses to attack your immune system because your body is already busy trying to regulate itself. Hitoshi smacked him on the arm for that. Hitoshi was wearing black jeans and a gray sweatshirt, while Izuku wore a pair of sweatpants and a t-shirt that read sweatshirt across the front. Hitoshi could never hope to understand his friend's fashion sense, or lack thereof. The teacher's lounge was mostly empty when they entered, save for Midnight and All Might. Midnight winked at them, and Hitoshi nodded back at her. He turned to his friend who was frozen with an unreadable look on his face, staring at All Might. All Might, skeletal as ever, was staring right back at him. They were close, and hadn't seen each other since this whole thing started. Hitoshi wondered how this interaction would go. Personally, he was betting on tears and maybe some hugs. My boy, All Might sounded upset. It made sense of course, but Hitoshi wasn't sure how ready he was to deal with both a crying Izuku and All Might. Hey All Might, Izuku said quietly. He sounded guilty. My boy, I'm glad you're all right. Could I speak to you for a moment? In private? Izuku nodded and the two silently retreated out of the room. Hitoshi glanced at Midnight again, unsure of what to make of the lack of, anything. He was expecting tears, relief, just something. But the pair retreated silently, not even sparing Hitoshi a glance. Midnight smiled softly at him, and he shrugged, moving to a couch to wait for the two to return. My boy, I am very glad that you're okay. Gave us quite a scare back there. Izuku nodded, staring at his lap. They were sitting in their usual secret meeting room. The air was tense. Izuku knew that All Might cared about him. There was a reason people thought they were father and son. Honestly, Izuku was surprised that he had never called the man dad. So yeah, he knew that his little stunt had probably upset his mentor. Worried him. And Izuku felt awful for doing that, but even more so he felt guilty for what he had almost lost. There was a reason he had put this conversation off the day before, ignoring texts and calls from the symbol of peace. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to go that far. He said quietly. I know, young Midoriya, I know. But you did go that far. As much as both of us hate it, you did. You need to be more careful with yourself. Be more careful with One for All. I know. I'm sorry. I wasn't thinking. No, you weren't. You never do, really, that's how I noticed you in the first place. When your feet move before your brain to rush in and save someone, it's admirable. Maybe a habit that needs some reining in, but admirable. However, this wasn't saving someone. You could have died, my boy. You must be careful. This isn't just your life at stake, it's the lives of everyone who you could save. Remember that? Izuku wasn't really sure what to say to that. He knew he could have ended the legacy. He could have destroyed the very thing that got him this far to begin with. He knew that. But it wasn't like he meant to. And besides, how many times had he almost died since getting the quirk? How many times had he almost died because of the quirk? Sure, this time it was different, but he'd never been scolded for almost ending the line of successors. All Might had always first and foremost been worried about Izuku's personal safety and well-being. He had never brought up the fact that if he died the quirk died with him, even though they both knew it. He always tried to make sure Izuku felt like he was worth saving, not just his quirk. But now he was looking down at the floor, disappointment and worry written clear as day across his face, while he made Izuku feel like his life wasn't his own. And maybe it wasn't. Maybe it hadn't been his own ever since that faithful day on the beach. Maybe his life was One for All's life. Maybe his life was only worth as many as he could save. That's why he had put off this conversation. If he had known he'd run into All Might the moment he set foot in the teacher's lounge, he might have avoided it. But there he was. He'd always been told his life was worth less than the lives of those around him. He was quirkless, useless, nothing more and everything less. He tried not to let it get to him. He had done a pretty good job of it too. Not perfect, of course, but he didn't hate himself at least. Sure, in middle school he had hated his life, or at least a lot of it, but never himself. He knew he was a good person, and that was enough to keep him afloat. And sure, he was always ready to throw his life down for somebody else's, but their lives were important, more important than him or his quirk. If One for All ended to save a life, then it would have done its job. He didn't think his life was worthless, but that would never stop him from setting it aside for someone else. It was hard to explain. But now, in this moment, One for All wouldn't have died saving someone. It would have died, cold and bloody, on his kitchen floor for his mother to find when she came home. And that was the difference, that was why All Might had that look on his face. Unsure of what to say, Izuku just nodded his head. Come here, my boy. Izuku let himself be pulled into a hug, but he didn't cry. He let his mentor whisper kind words into his hair, let him explain how much he cared for Izuku, but he felt the unspoken words just as much, if not more. All Might cared for him like a son, like his own child. But they both had that streak in them, the streak of putting others first. Of putting the power to save others, One for All, first. Being selfless. And what Izuku had done was one of the most selfish things he could think of. But he let himself be selfish for just a little more. He listened to the kind words of his mentor as best he could, though really he was more listening to the sound of his voice than the words themselves. He wasn't sure when they had all muddled together, but they had, and tried to let them drape over him like a blanket. It was a thin, scratchy blanket, but in that moment, it felt like more than he would ever deserve. He apologized again, made promises to never go that far, and when the words caught in his throat like bile, he told himself he deserved it. He couldn't tell if he was trapped inside his head, drowning, or outside of it, and floating away from reality. Either way, he missed the warmth of his morning with Hitoshi, when he'd been comfortably settled on the surface of the waves instead of wherever he was now. Eventually, All Might ruffled his hair and sent him back to his friend with a smile, not his All Might grin, but a real genuine smile and a kiss on the top of his curls. Even though he had been disappointed and worried about One for All, he still cared about Midoriya like his own, and was glad he was safe. Hitoshi glanced up when the door to the teacher's lounge opened again. He had been drawing Midnight in his sketchbook. She was always happy to model for him, but he preferred to draw when she didn't know he was looking. It let him capture Nemuri, his aunt, rather than her hero persona. Izuku had been gone with All Might for a while, almost 45 minutes. Hitoshi had expected him to come back with puffy eyes and a watery smile, but instead he saw a vacant look in his eyes. Izuku walked over and sat next to Hitoshi on the couch, but it was like he was only half aware that Hitoshi was there at all. Hitoshi waited for the teen to say something, but he just sat on the couch, elbows on his knees, and stared at the ground. Hitoshi looked at Nemuri, who was watching the boy with a worried crease on her brow. "Hey kid, I just graded your art history essay, great work. Honestly, that was the most interesting breakdown of Michelangelo's work that I've seen. Good job." Izuku looked up at her like he was trying to puzzle out what she had said. It took a minute until he seemed to figure it out. Thanks, Midnight-sensei." His voice sounded strained, like talking was physically painful. Hitoshi knew that feeling, and he wondered how it had come to be during the boy's talk with All Might. He and Nemuri shared a glacé, unsure of exactly how to help the boy. Hitoshi settled for asking, Do you watch me draw? Or I could give you a page of my sketchbook if you want." Izuku stared at him for a long moment, and he wondered if he had said the wrong thing, before the boy rearranged to have his head resting on Hitoshi's shoulder, thighs pressed together. Hitoshi nodded and resumed his sketch of his aunt. Normally he hated people watching him draw. It was bad enough when they saw the finished product, but even worse when they watched him get there, judging his mistakes and criticizing his process. But watching the pencil work across the page seemed to calm Izuku, bring him back to earth even a little bit, so Hitoshi decided it was worth it. In fact, the boy's head on his shoulder was almost relaxing, and having a second gaze on his page didn't bother him as much as it normally would. "Hey listeners! How was your day?" Hisashi strolled into the teacher's lounge once class ended, hair gelled up and smiling. Hitoshi looked up at him, then glanced down at his friend. Izuku had passed just about the whole day watching him draw, only taking a break for Hitoshi to go get them something to eat from lunch rush. It had been a pain to avoid the class, but he knew they'd have questions for him, and he wasn't sure what on earth he would be able to say to them. He and Izuku had eaten in silence, though Izuku was more just pushing the food around his plate until Hitoshi managed to convince him to actually choke some of it down. He was worried for his friend even right after he woke up in the infirmary. He was more responsive than this. The only thing that seemed to bring Izuku back to reality was watching drawings and sketches form in the pages of Hitoshi's sketchbook. So, Hitoshi had spent the whole day drawing. His hand was cramping a bit and he was running out of things to draw, the most recent being a sketch of a pencil holder from one of the tables, but at one point he'd drawn a silly little comic that earned a soft huff of laughter from his friend, so he counted it as a win. The day was good. What about you, Pops? Any particularly bad English essays? Well, I'm not sure why Aoyama wrote part of his in French, but aside from that everyone did pretty well this time around. French? Your guess is as good as mine. Hisashi laughed and looked at Izuku, who had lifted his head and offered a small smile, but nothing more. Hitoshi subtly shook his head and began to pack up his things. Dad would probably come in soon and then they could all head back to the apartment together. Maybe he could get Izuku to eat something else or take a nap. The kid was barely there. Hitoshi needed to explain what had happened to his dads, but he figured it'd be best to do it without Izuku listening. When Dad did come in, he acknowledged everyone with a grunt before zeroing in on his problem child. Hey kid. Shoyuta sighed and handed Hizashi his sleeping bag before walking over to the teen and crouching down so they were eye level. You good to walk back to the apartment, problem child? Izuku stared at him, once again trying to puzzle out the words spoken to him. It didn't look like he was going to figure it out. Shoyuta waited a moment before turning around and gesturing for the kid to climb on. Izuku hesitated a moment before climbing on and wrapping his arms around the man's neck. Grab his bag, Hitoshi. The boy in question nodded and they all left the teacher's lounge without much more fanfare. Hitoshi sincerely hoped that they'd be able to avoid everyone until they got back to the apartment, but fate had other plans. Tsuyu and Uraraka saw them in the hall and Hitoshi braced for an onslaught of questions. The questions never came, however, because Shoyuta leveled the girls with a look and silently shook his head. He didn't glare at them, but his normally blank face showed understanding as he kept walking. And perhaps that's why Tsuyu knew not to bother them. Uraraka looked like she was about to call out anyway, but Tsuyu gently grabbed her arm and shook her head. The girl glanced back at the retreating form of her teacher and her friend before deflating and turning towards Hitoshi. She sent him a soft, worried smile and mouthing, "Is he okay? He'll be fine. Don't worry." Hitoshi mouthed back and turned away as the two girls retreated. Hitoshi hoped that no one else would cross their paths, but not 2 minutes later they ran into Bakugo. That interaction was odd. Bakugo was walking with Kirishima, who looked like he wanted nothing more than to run over and talk to the group, but Bakugo held him back by the arm. His stare was zeroed in on Izuku, and his expression was unreadable for a moment before he glared at the ground, shoulders even tenser than usual. "Come on, shitty hair. Let's go back to the dorms. Leave the nerd alone." "But Bakubro, aren't you worried? I mean dash. I said let's go back to the dorms, or are you the deaf one, you fucking idiot?" Kirishima turned to Bakugo for a moment, and something in the blonde's face must have convinced him to drop it, because he allowed himself to be led away. Hitoshi was confused. He'd expected Bakugo to run up to them and try to explode Izuku for missing class, but instead he had gone without so much as a word to the boy. The rest of the trip was uneventful, and it seemed like Izuku hadn't even noticed the two interactions, face buried in Shuta's capture scarf. Aizawa took off his own shoes, then Izuku's before setting the boy down on the couch and wrapping a blanket around him. He told Hitoshi to put the bags in his room, then gestured for him and Hizashi to come into the kitchen. He's a little dissociated. Not completely, he's at least aware of some of the stuff around him, but he doesn't really understand it. "Hitoshi, do you know what caused it? Has he been like this all day?" "No, he was fine this morning. He only got all quiet after he and All Might talked. I don't know what they talked about, but when he came back he was just..." "All Might?" "Yeah, he was in the teacher's lounge when we got there and asked to talk to Izuku. They were gone for like 45 minutes. "What did that idiot say?" his dad muttered before shaking his head. "Well, the best thing we can do is just be there for him when he gets back to us and try to make sure he's comfortable." "Has he eaten anything today?" "Yeah, but not much. I tried to get him to eat lunch, but he only had some of it." "Good job. I'll make him something light or maybe some tea, and you can just do whatever, okay? He'll come back eventually. Zashich, just get ready for your show. I'll handle the problem child." Hizashi nodded and pressed a kiss to Shuta's temple, squeezing his shoulders. "Got it. I know you say you're bad with kids' show, but you're amazing. Keep me updated in the little listener, yeah?" "Shut up. I'm just being logical. I'll keep you updated, but if you don't leave soon you'll be late." Hizashi rolled his eyes and ruffled Hitoshi's hair before leaving the kitchen to change and head to the station. Shoyuta seemed to realize that Hitoshi wasn't exactly sure what to do, so he asked the boy to help him make some ramen. Hitoshi agreed and began to pull out ingredients. "Izuku. I'm gonna have something to eat. Dad made some for you too." Thanks." Well, that was more words than he'd gotten since Izuku responded to Nemuri that morning, so he counted it as a win and guided the green-haired teen to the table, where 2 steaming bowls of ramen waited. They ate in silence and Hitoshi tried to stop himself from constantly glancing at his friend. Dad had gone to take a nap and do some work in the study, so Hitoshi decided to keep an eye on his friend. His dad explained that he didn't need to, made sure that Hitoshi wasn't going to push himself and make himself uncomfortable, but he insisted. Hitoshi finished eating first, and unsure of what else to do, he started talking. He wasn't as good at rambling as some other people in the class, least of all Izuku, but he blabbered on anyway. He talked about cats, art, funny storied about his dads and their friends, anything. Izuku didn't respond to most of it, but as he slowly finished his ramen, consciousness seemed to slowly filter back into his eyes. By the time Hitoshi was explaining how Namuri and Tensei get when they went to drunk karaoke, Izuku began to quietly giggle at appropriate points, and Hitoshi practically beamed. Eventually they moved back to the couch, and after another hour of mindless chatter, Izuku began to offer tiny responses and even a few jokes which left Hitoshi wheezing. Arguably the jokes weren't funny enough to warrant that much laughter, but Hitoshi was just glad that his friend was responding again. He was glad Izuku was okay. By the time his dad came in to check on them, Izuku was back to how he'd been before his meeting with All Might, smiling and chattering. He was delving into a short ramble about how Momo could theoretically imitate Midnight's quirk if she just looked into the chemical makeup of the gas that Midnight produced. Momo could even improve on the drawbacks by putting the gas in an aerosol can or something to control who's affected. Actually, why doesn't Midnight do that? If she wants to stick to her theme, she could put it in perfume bottles or something. Holy shit, Zu, you're right. You should tell her that. Izuku blushed and spluttered for a moment before he paused and then blushed significantly deeper. Zu, he squeaked. And oh, would you look at that, it's Hitoshi's turn to blush. Well, you call me Toshi. It's only fair. He defended, crossing his arms and trying to look serious. He was failing quite spectacularly. Oh yeah, I guess you're right. Toshi. They both smiled, and the conversation moved on with the addition of a new nickname. Shoyuta was worried. He had every right to be, really. He had come back from a full day of dealing with a worried and overprotective Hell class. A full day of warding off questions and trying to ignore the tense air that filled the class while the resident sunshine was missing. He had dealt with that the whole day, and then walked into the teacher's lounge and seen his problem child subdued and near unresponsive. Just what had All Might said to the kid? And had he not noticed the fact that his student was obviously not okay? He just left the kid to wander back to Hitoshi and done nothing? Midoriya might not have ended up quite so out of it if someone had caught what was going on earlier and worked with him to bring him back down to earth. Hitoshi had done good, letting the boy watch him draw and trying to get him to eat, but he was still just a kid who was worried over his friend. Maybe if Shoyuta had been there, he would have been able to do some grounding with the kid to bring him back, or at the very least he might have been able to catch All Might and ask what the fuck had happened. It was obvious that Midoriya was aware that people were speaking to him, but it didn't seem like he really understood much of what was going on. Shoyuta felt awful that he hadn't checked in earlier, but with how worried all the students were, he hadn't been able to sneak off to check on the kid during the day. He would have gone during lunch, but he was stuck on monitor duty that day. Which meant that Hitoshi had been the kid's only company all day, and as amazing as Hitoshi was, there was no way it hadn't been draining on the kid. Shoyuta tried to make sure that Hitoshi knew that it was okay to take breaks from looking after his friend, make sure that he knew his mental health was important too, but Hitoshi was adamant that he was fine. He had a determined glint in his eye, and Shoyuta knew that trying to get him to take a break for himself was only going to upset him, so he gave up and retreated to the office. He leaned his head in his hands, took a few deep breaths and tried to focus on some grading he had to do. When Shoyuta re-entered the living room a while later and witnessed Midoriya mid-ramble about new support items for Midnight, he's not ashamed to say he signed in relief and fondly watched from the entryway for a minute before walking in. And also, I've been wondering what her whip is made of? Is it similar to Aizawa-sensei's capture weapon? The way she uses it in battle is incredible. It sucks that no one respects its versatility just because they're so caught up on the theme. Or maybe that's the point. So that villains don't picture it as a threat they need to be wary of and just see it as an accessory? If so, then that's really smart dash. You're right on all points, kid. Midoriya squeaked and whipped his head toward Aizawa. Aizawa-sensei. Ah, well, I guess that's one theory confirmed. You can just call me Aizawa outside of class, kid. Drop the sensei stuff? Midoriya nodded, and Aizawa got the distinct feeling that the kid was not going to drop the sensei. You should hear his other ideas for Midnight, they're really good. I did hear, you should bring up the perfume bottle idea to her. It's a good one. Midoriya turned red and tried to insist that the idea wasn't that good, and really anyone could have thought of it, but Aizawa shut down the self-depreciation immediately. So kid, do you want to talk to me about how you were feeling earlier? Or we can just leave it for now. Up to you. Izuku curled in on himself a little bit and Hitoshi tried to subtly glance back and forth between his friend and his dad. Aizawa hoped that asking wasn't going to trigger anything, but he also didn't want to ignore what had happened. I don't know if I should, I mean it's fine, like it's not really important, and it's kinda complicated dash. Zoo, whatever happened wasn't fine. It upset you. That's not fine. Hitoshi tried to look Izuku in the face, but the other teen had turned away, suddenly finding the wall incredibly interesting. I mean it is fine, it's not a big deal. Really. It was just an emotional talk, you know? Emotions are, draining. I mean, you know me, it takes a lot of energy to cry this much. The joke sounded hollow, and he knew it. He also knew that he hadn't cried at all that day, but no one else needed to know that. He glanced at Aizawa. All right, kid. The man didn't look entirely convinced, but wasn't going to push the issue. It makes sense to be tired after all of this. Just know you can talk to me, or Hizashi, or any of your friends, all right? And, problem child, anything that upsets you or drains you isn't fine. This sort of thing is important, and even if you don't want to make a big deal out of it, that doesn't mean that it should just be brushed over. Let someone know if you start feeling drained so we can catch it early and give you a break. I'll try. Then you, Aizawa-sensei. Of course, kid. And it's just Aizawa or even Shoyuta outside of class. Speaking of class, you can have tomorrow off if you still aren't feeling up to it. Izuku nodded and seemed to ponder for a minute before looking back at his teacher. Can I decide in the morning? 'Cause right now I don't really feel up to class, but I might feel better in the morning and I've already missed a lot of school. Zoo, if anyone can miss a few days of class it's you. I think you'll be okay. Hitoshi frowned at the idea of going to class himself, not keen on leaving his friend alone the next day, but also not keen on falling behind. If Izuku stayed home without him, who would he stay with? Obviously not All Might, because as much as Izuku seemed like he wanted to brush it off, he was also a shit liar, and it was obvious that something had happened. He just didn't know what. Hitoshi's right. There are notes for you from Ida to help catch you up once you're up to it, and another day of missed class isn't much in the grand scheme of things. Hitoshi should probably try to make it to class tomorrow though. If you want to stay home then Zashi or I can stay with you, alright? But, I mean, Izuku didn't want to make anyone else miss class, but he also knew they weren't about to just leave him alone. God, this whole ordeal was such a hassle. It was so much easier when nobody knew, but oh well, nothing much to do about it now. Hey, I'll let you know in the morning. I'm sorry. Zoo, with all due respect, what in the ever-loving fuck are you sorry for? Izuku snorted despite himself at Hitoshi's incredulous tone. Making all of you worry and stuff. And making you miss class. And also imposing on your apartment and Hitoshi had clapped a hand over Izuku's mouth and sighed. Respectfully, shut the fuck up. No apologies are needed. You do the same thing for me. Actually, you do the same thing and then probably somehow turn it into a big grand event about the magic of friendship and broken bones. But my point stands. Hitoshi pointedly ignored how the word friendship tasted bitter in his mouth. He was very quickly distracted when Izuku licked his hand. EW. Zoo, what the fuck? Hitoshi wiped his hand off on the side of Izuku's face and very narrowly avoided being bitten in retaliation. You had it coming, Toshi. You had it coming. And apologies are needed. No. Yes. No. Yes. Would you have made me apologize? Exactly. No apologies needed. If you really have to say something, just like, I don't know, say thank you? You don't need to thank us either, but it's better than a bunch of apologies. Hitoshi's right again, Midoriya. Firstly, it's my job to do this sort of thing, both as your teacher and as a hero, and secondly, you should know by now that I don't do things unless I want to. Thank you, Izuku whispered, slightly curled in on himself. Hitoshi frowned. He got an idea. You're welcome. Now, moving on, have you done an analysis on Eraserhead? Izuku turned very red and squeaked. Toshi, you can't, I mean it's not like dash. Hitoshi smirked and raised an eyebrow, turning mischievously towards Aizawa. Well, 'Cause I'd be curious about it if you had. Don't you agree, Dad? If you had an analysis on me, I would be curious. The very tops of Aizawa's ears turned ever so slightly pink at the idea that his student had been a big enough fan before even meeting him to have done any sort of analysis. He was an underground hero, he wasn't supposed to have fans. But then this kid had recognized him on the very first day of classes. Even Hitoshi had taken a few days to catch on when they first met. If you would want to hear it? I don't have my notebooks with me, so it'd be off the top of my head, and it's not very good either way. I'd love to hear it, kid. God, why was he going to soft for this kid? For this class. He sounded so much like a dad. Which to be fair he was. Just not to this particular problem child. Okay, well, first off is your quirk erasure. It's such a cool quirk, super useful in fights. The surprise factor that hits your opponents when you first cancel their quirk is great to disorient them, which is partially why your tactic of dropping down from rooftops and patrolling at night is so great. People also tend to rely a lot on their quirks for their fighting style, so unless they have a lot of training in quirkless combat, once you level the playing field you can easily outclass them. You can't cancel mutant-type quirks though, but your capture weapon and fighting style allows you to stay away from them, or to use their strength against them. Your quirk deactivates when you blink, and the longer the fight drags on, the more frequently you have to blink, which is another reason why your surprise tactic is good. Your goggles help to hide your eyes, but honestly their design isn't very good. Like I get the slotted design and stuff to help hide which way you're looking, but also there are so many improvements that you could make, like adding some sort of mist to help with the dry eye mid-battle when you can't get out your eye drops. Speaking of your costume actually, it is really smart. The whole hobo look that a lot of people pick up on is probably intentional. It's another way to sneak up on people, same thing with the sleeping bag. If criminals just think you're some random homeless person laying around, they won't pay any mind to you until you attack. You hide in plain sight and they just glance over you. The baggy clothes also hide your physique, which adds yet another element of surprise. The long hair adds to this too, but honestly you should probably tie it back somehow. It floats when your quirk is active, maybe a secondary effect from one of your parents? Maybe one of them had some sort of levitation quirk. The main reason it affects your hair is probably to make sure that your hair doesn't block your vision. My guess is that even though the long hair helps with your whole look, you also understand that long hair isn't really good in a fight. So why don't you tie it back? My guess is that it gives you headaches. I've seen you tie it back once or twice in class, or for a press conference, but if you leave it up for a long time it probably hurts. That said though, there are braiding techniques for people with sensitive scalps, it'd be something good to look into. I also have so many questions and theories. Like what happens if you look at yourself in the mirror? And is your quirk all or nothing? Or could you use it to just weaken a quirk? 'Cause that would be great for helping students who have trouble with control. How much of your quirk actually relies on sight versus awareness? Like, when you fight in the dark and can't see well, obviously your quirk still works. If you were in a pitch-black room and used your quirk on someone, would it work? Would it only work if you knew that they were there? Does it have a distance limit? Does it work through glass and mirrors? If it worked through mirrors, you could add those to your goggles and be able to use your quirk on people who are behind you. Also, what counts as a mutation? 'Cause I've been wondering what type of quirk Present Mix voice is. It's classified as an emitter, but I don't think that's it. He can still talk when you cancel his quirk, but he can't yell. If you really canceled his whole quirk, he wouldn't be able to speak at all. My guess is that his voice box is slightly mutated to handle the emitter side of his quirk, so that's why you can't cancel it entirely. This is even more likely because most mutations come in at birth, and so did Present Mix voice, so it wouldn't be surprising if it also had a mutation type aspect. So many quirks nowadays have extra aspects. Like Ashido, her quirk allows her to produce acid, but her skin has a mutation which protects her from the acid. A few generations ago, she'd probably have had one or the other, but as quirks have gotten more powerful, people have also adapted to them. That's why I don't buy into the quirk singularity theory, at least not entirely. Quirks may be more powerful now, but they're also safer, more user-friendly. Like when quirks first came to be, almost no ice or fire users had any sort of temperature resistance, and now it's rare to find one without temperature resistance. So, I don't think that quirks are ever going to be too much for our bodies to handle. We'll probably just end up with more small mutations over time. And oh no, I'm rambling, I'm so sorry, I can shut up now. Adjustran to the Buddha Razor had squirked his face Shomikami dash. Hitoshi and Aizawa, who were both known for being able to keep a blank face, were practically slack-jawed and staring at Izuku, who very much wanted to curl up in a ball of embarrassment. He could feel himself blushing horribly. Holy shit, kid. It had taken several minutes to get Izuku to stop hiding his head in his hands after his rant about Aizawa's quirk, but once he finally calmed down, he noticed how neither Aizawa nor Hitoshi looked creeped out. If anything, they looked impressed. What? That was incredible. I hadn't even thought of some of those questions myself. I didn't realize that Zashi's quirk might have a mutation and I'm married to him. I've been to a professional analyst before and they didn't come even close to that level of detail. That's a serious skill. Who told you that it wasn't impressive? Analysis skills like that are invaluable in the field. I knew you liked analyzing quirks, but I had no idea how serious you were about it. Your theories were right too. I do have a sensitive scalp and my mother had a small levitation aspect to her quirk. Oh. Zoo, holy shit, that was incredible. You said that was off the top of your head? That your journals are better? That's amazing. Can you do me? Yeah, I have journal entries on all of the teachers and both hero classes. I guess I could show you sometime? If you'd like? I know it's kinda creepy, but Midoriya, analysis skills like that aren't creepy, they're incredible. God, as much as I hate the rat, Nizu would probably love to help you hone them. Are you self-taught? Yeah, I just like taking notes on heroes I saw on the news when I was little. I think my first notebook was written in crayon. Wait, did you say Nizu would be interested? It was now Izuku who was slack-jawed. His analysis was never anything special, but from the looks Aizawa and Hitoshi were giving him, clearly they thought otherwise. And Nizu? If he got to talk with the smartest being in the school, and probably the country, hell maybe the world, about his analysis, he might just die of happiness. And probably embarrassment or anxiety. But still. And they didn't think it was creepy. Even his friends thought it was creepy. Well, Denki didn't a lot of the time, as he also tended to go on tangents about what he was interested in. But aside from that, it always seemed like everyone thought it was creepy. Even All Might. Izuku dulled slightly at the thought of his mentor but shoved the thoughts aside as best he could. Kid, the fact that you're self-taught is even more impressive. And you know I don't give out praise like this easy. It was all Izuku could do to nod. No one had ever been so positive about his analysis, so he wasn't quite sure what to do about it. Eventually, the conversation drifted again, and Aizawa offered the boys the notes from that day. They retreated to Hitoshi's room to work on copying them. It was only around 2 hours later that Izuku found himself beginning to drift off on top of his work. Hitoshi rolled his eyes but lifted him onto the bed nonetheless. Izuku protested for a minute before giving up. Even though he had lied about his conversation with All Might, he hadn't lied about being drained. Having so many people worry about him was tiring. As he drifted off, Izuku did feel that itch under his skin, that urge to go and find a razor, but he quelled the feeling by digging his nails into his forearms under the blanket. Hitoshi was none the wiser, and the marks would fade by the time he woke up. The pain and pressure was just enough for Izuku to finally succumb to his exhaustion and sleep. When Izuku woke up the next morning, he spotted Hitoshi splayed out on a futon on the floor, groggily waving his arm around to turn off the alarm. Izuku wasn't sure how to feel about the disappointment that he hadn't gotten to cuddle the purple-haired teen. He shook off the feeling and rubbed his eyes. Izuku was tired. He had gone to bed early and slept well for once, but he still felt an oppressive exhaustion clamping down around him. School, and by extension friends, sounded very unappealing. He didn't want to force Aizawa or Yamada to stay home, but he also didn't want to go to class. He knew that he'd have to face his friends eventually, just not yet. He hadn't even thought of what to tell them. Hey guys, sorry I haven't been around, I almost killed myself. It was an accident though, don't worry. I was only trying to harm myself, not kill myself. Like that would go over well. He had a feeling that even if he just told them he didn't want to talk about it, they'd probably still push. They wouldn't mean any harm by it, but they'd still worry. And it's not like Izuku didn't trust them, he was just embarrassed. He didn't want to be treated like glass. He didn't want to be treated differently, period. Kaken would probably figure it out though, whether or not Izuku told him. He was good at that. Kaken already knew about this from a while ago though, so he probably wouldn't act any different. That was helpful at least. Maybe he could help Izuku tell everyone else to fuck off. Well, maybe not everyone. He could tell Tsu and Todoroki, and maybe Uraraka or Ida. Tsu and Todoroki would be the easiest, being blunt yet understanding. They probably wouldn't act any different and would just tell Izuku to lean on them if need be. Easy and simple. Uraraka and Ida, on the other hand, were more likely to freak out or ask too many questions. They were some of his best friends, but Izuku wasn't sure he'd be able to tell them. Izuku was shaken out of his thoughts by Hitoshi. "Good morning, Zu. You good? You've been staring off for a minute. Do you want to stay home?" I don't know." As soon as the words left his mouth, Izuku felt frustrated tears well in his eyes. He didn't want to go to class and face everyone, but he felt so guilty staying away, especially when someone would have to stay with him. Whoa, hey, it's okay. You still have a little while to decide. Do you want me to get Dad and see what he thinks? It was all Izuku could do to nod. Hitoshi looked concerned, and still ruffled from sleep, which was oddly pretty. He had such pretty friends. And they were so nice too. Hitoshi gave him a quick hug and darted out of the room, returning a moment later with an equally groggy Aizawa, who took one look at Izuku and told him to stay home. "It's illogical for you to go to class and drain yourself more, kid. I'll stay back with you and get some paperwork done. Someone can cover for the hell class, alright? Don't worry about it." Hitoshi had ducked out of the room to wash up and get dressed. Izuku found himself wishing that he had stayed in the room so he could get another hug, but the hair ruffle from Aizawa was a decent enough replacement. "It's okay, problem child. Just go back to sleep if you can, if not then Zashi can make you something to eat. Which do you want to do?" Izuku shook his head against Aizawa's hand. He wasn't really sure which option he was saying no to, but he eventually ended up laying back down and drifting off. Hitoshi whispered for him to sleep well, dumbass. Don't worry about class. And he had grumbled some gibberish in response before fully falling back to sleep. It was almost 9 o'clock by the time Izuku woke up again. He shuffled around Hitoshi's room and slowly got dressed in clean sweats and a t-shirt before walking to the bathroom and washing up. Aizawa was sitting on the couch with his laptop by the time Izuku emerged. "Good morning, kid. There's some leftover breakfast in the fridge for you, just heat it up. Or make something else if you want." "Alright, thank you." Izuku moved to the kitchen to heat up the miso soup and rice that had been left for him. There was also a soft-boiled egg to add. Izuku stayed in the kitchen to eat, zoning out and staring at the wall. He was okay. Not great, but okay. Well, actually, maybe okay was a strong word. Izuku was neutral? Not horrible? He was something. He was certainly feeling a lot of feelings, but what any of them really were, he couldn't be sure. The only thing he could solidly identify was that he was tired. The apartment was quiet, and that was nice. The food wasn't anything show-stopping, but it tasted good. Knowing that Aizawa was just a step away was also nice. Aizawa was good. But goddamn was Izuku tired. He'd only just woken up for the second time that morning, but he was already exhausted. He wanted to decide on which of his friends to tell, and how to tell them, and what to tell those who he wasn't giving the full story to. But the thought of having to actually say anything, to have to explain himself, made him itch. The though of having to look at his friends who were probably beyond worried, and tell them he almost killed himself, was nauseating. And then for those he didn't tell, they'd know that something was up. They'd realize that he had told some and not others. Would they be offended? He had a feeling Uraraka might be a little hurt if she thought he was keeping something from her. Ida would probably worry a lot. He'd think that Izuku was pushing him away like what Ida himself had done with Stain. Kirishima would probably worry, but he'd also probably understand. He wouldn't push. Kaken would figure out what had happened whether or not Izuku told him. He would just know because he was Kaken and Kaken was just like that. He'd figure it out, but he would probably just leave it be, or maybe he'd yell at the others to leave the nerd the fuck alone. It's none of you fucking business. He wouldn't have done that in middle school, but he's grown a lot since then. And then his mom, Oh Kami, his mom. She'd be back in town tonight. Izuku wished she would stay away longer. He loved her so much, but she wasn't what he needed right now. She'd worry and cry and Izuku would feel horrible for making her sad, and then he'd want to chase that floaty feeling to get away from his guilt. Izuku had done this before, told her before, and now he was just waiting for the replay of what had happened. His mom would try so hard not to treat him differently, but then she'd look at him with worried eyes, and she'd do what any good mom would, and she'd check on him. On days when the idea of hurting himself hadn't even crossed his mind, she'd ask, "How are you? Have you been feeling okay, honey?" In that tone, and he'd have to nod and say he was doing great, when in reality, her asking it all was just setting him up for a relapse. Not to mention Izuku just didn't have the social battery to talk to her. He loved his mom, but she was just so much sometimes. And everything else was already so much, that he just wished it would all go away for a while until he was ready to deal with it. He felt like a horrible, ungrateful son for not wanting to see her when all she did was care about him, but goddamn it, Izuku didn't know what to do when people cared. He had gone so long with so little care that once he had its warmth it just burned him. Like being out in the cold for hours and then sipping lukewarm tea and feeling like you were trying to hold liquid fire in your mouth. "Hey Aizawa-sensei?" The dark-haired man glanced up from his laptop. "Ya kid?" And dropped the sensei, "It's my day off." "Am I gonna see my mom tonight?" Aizawa raised an eyebrow at Izuku's hesitant tone and set his laptop down. "That was the plan, we were going to get he a visitor's pass so that you two could meet on campus. She could come to the apartment for dinner, or we could find another room for you two to hang out in for a while if you'd rather see her alone." "Why?" Izuku hesitated. On one hand, he knew that if he asked, his teacher would let him put off seeing her. On the other hand, this probably wasn't going to get any easier the longer he waited, and his mom would be immeasurably hurt if he said he didn't want to see her. "I was just wondering. I think I'd just want to see her alone for a little bit. I don't think I'll have the energy for a dinner with her and everyone else." "Sounds like a plan, problem child. And you don't have to see her tonight if you don't want to." Curse Aizawa's ability to read in between the lines. "I know. Is there anything else on your mind, kid? Anything else?" Yeah. There was so much that he couldn't even put it into words. So much that it bubbled out of him in a halfway hysterical laugh. It started as a snort, then a giggle, and now he must look insane, laughing so hard that he had to push away from the counter to avoid doubling over into his empty bowl. He was laughing so hard that he didn't even notice Aizawa walking over until he was asking if it was okay to touch him, and then he was wrapped in a warm hug, and oh, now he's crying. God, what he wouldn't give to stop crying so damn much. Shoyuta wasn't really sure what to do when his kid student doubled over in hysterical laughter after being asked what was on his mind. After a moment though, tears started flowing down the kid's cheeks and he decided it was time to intervene. "Can I give you a hug, problem child?" He was answered with a jerky nod and pulled the teen into his chest. The laughter died down to quiet sobs, and Shoyuta just carefully carted his hand through green curls and waited. He waited a while until the sobs fizzled out and the kid was just leaning his forehead into the front of Shuta's shirt. "I'm sorry." Shoyuta shook his head. "You have nothing to be sorry for, kid. Don't apologize when you don't need to, it's illogical. Right, Sor? Thank you? Of course. Now do you want to tell me what that was about?" Izuku hesitated for a moment, trying to think of what to say. "Everything, it's just, I don't know. Everything is just a lot." Shoyuta nodded. "Yeah, good. It is. Do you want to move to the couch and talk about it?" Another short hesitation, followed by a nod. The kid should probably talk through some of what he was feeling. And Shoyuta still wanted to know what had happened the day before. He needed to know if he had reason to punch the symbol of peace. Or at least, more reason than usual. Once they were both situated on the couch with Izuku leaning against Shuta's shoulder, fiddling with the hem of his shirt, Shoyuta waited patiently for Izuku to start talking. The kid explained his dilemma with his friends, explained how tried he was, and explained how he loved his mom, but she was a lot to handle. Shoyuta listened quietly, occasionally humming or grunting in response. Once the kid reached a good place to pause, he spoke up. "Well, kid, I can't say you're wrong, because you're not. You can't just ignore your friends forever, and chances are they'll be a bit pushy or upset with how much or how little you tell them, but they're also your friends, and eventually they'll accept what you tell them and move on. I can help by telling them not to push you, but kid, the best thing you can do is just tell them that it's not something you're comfortable talking about. That's not on them, and it's not something you can control either. It's just a fact that they're going to have to accept. And they're smart kids, hellions, sure, but smart. They'll understand. And I think you have a good list of people who you want to give the full story to. Azui, Todoroki and Bakugo are all, well, Bakugo isn't exactly level-headed, but for the most part they all know when to push and when not to. It'll be okay. And as for your mother, it's okay that you don't feel ready to see her dash. I'm gonna see her tonight. Well, it's not my favorite idea, but putting it off won't help. And that's okay. I'm just saying that it doesn't make you a bad person or a bad son to be hesitant about seeing her. It's tiring to have to comfort someone when they're worrying about you. And, while it's not your job to comfort her, I know that comforting her is exactly what you're going to do anyway. And it's okay that doing that sounds draining and not like something you want to do. Just because she's your mother doesn't mean she's perfect and is always going to know exactly what to do or how to help you. It's okay for you to feel that way. Izuku nodded, and they both stayed quiet for a minute to think. Izuku's mind drifted to the other things on his mind: All Might, One for All, and being a hero. He couldn't tell Aizawa about everything, but it'd be so nice to have just one other person to confide in. One person who wasn't All Might or Gran Torino. Izuku loved both of them, but it'd be so fucking nice to have someone who was more down to earth than the symbol of peace or an old man who liked pretending to be senile. And what was stopping him? Wasn't it his quirk now? If Izuku died, One for All would die, and didn't that make it his? Didn't that make it his secret? Honestly, why in the fuck did All Might still get to call the shots? It wasn't the retired hero's quirk anymore. It was Izuku's. Before Izuku even really knew what he was saying, the words had already left his mouth. I was quirkless, you know. Aizawa stiffened. I did not know that. What? Quirkless? I have the extra toe joint and everything. Kid, what? I'm pretty sure you have a quirk, I've seen it plenty. It's not mine. Izuku refused to look at his teacher. Midoriya, what on earth are you talking about? What do you mean it's not yours? Well, I guess it kind of is now. It wasn't at first though, it was All Might's. And then came the story. The sludge villain meeting his idol, the rooftop, Aizawa's hold tightened around his student at that, the second encounter, cleaning the beach, being given a godlike power with no instruction and using it for the first time on the zero-pointer. Keeping it a secret, learning how to not break himself, being told that it was his turn next, telling Kaken, all for one, getting Black Whip, seeing the previous holders. All of it. By the time Izuku was done, Aizawa was stone still and tense. Izuku risked a glance at his teacher's face, and almost snorted at the look, which was a mix of shock, anger, disbelief, and begrudging acceptance at the story that was eons above his pay grade. So let me get this straight. All Might ignored protocol for a villain attack, crushed your dreams on a roof, only to turn around and give you a ridiculous power that I almost expelled you for not being able to control. Then he proceeded to ask you not to tell anyone about your goddamn haunted quirk, which is actually multiple quirks, and it all comes with a centuries-old nemesis? Am I getting all of that? I told Kaken about it. So, it's not like I didn't tell anyone. Problem child, what the fuck? Yeah. That's how I feel. Izuku said with a snort. Is that what caused yesterday? Izuku tightened his grip on his teacher's forearm. He was unsure when it had happened, but he was clinging to the appendage like a teddy bear. Sort of. He wanted to tell me to be more careful with One for All. If I die, then the quirk can't get passed on and the legacy dies. He said that I need to be careful because if I die without protecting anyone, then One for All won't have served its purpose. If I'm gone, then I can't save anyone, and I really will be useless. Okay, first of all, you aren't useless. You never were. Wait. Deku means useless, doesn't it? Izuku nodded. It used to. It's another way of reading my name, and it's what kids called me before I got One for All. Uraraka helped me reclaim it, so I made it my hero name. But, got it. Yet, but back to what I was saying. You aren't useless. You never were with or without your quirk. You've never been less than or worthless or anything else. You've always had a hero's heart and determination, and even if you never got your quirk, I have no doubt you would have gotten just as far. Anyone who told you that you couldn't be a hero, that you were less than, was wrong. Izuku teared up again at that. The words soothed a deep wound on the quirkless little kid inside of him that had wanted nothing more than to help people. And kid, while yes, it is true that you can't save anyone if you're dead, the way you're thinking of it isn't quite right. Yes, I want to curb your self-sacrificing tendencies, but not because dying will stop you from saving people. Tell me, kid, what do heroes do? Save people? And what are you? Izuku gave Aizawa an odd look. I'm a hero. Before. That. Izuku scrunched up his face. Before being a hero? A student? Nope, before that. A kid. A person. You are a person who deserves to be saved just as much as everyone else. You deserve to be safe and happy because you are a person. I want to stop you from tossing your life away, not because dying will stop you from saving other people, but because you also deserve to be saved. And now your self-sacrificing streak makes a lot more sense. If you were told over and over again that your life didn't mean as much, those words and feelings are going to stick with you. It doesn't matter that you have a quirk now, those words and feelings don't just vanish. And that's okay. Now that I know, I'll be able to help you. Every hero is a little self-sacrificing. It's part of the job. But there's a big difference between putting your life on the line because you're more qualified to do so than a civilian, and putting your life on the line because you think your life isn't worth as much as the one you're trying to save. Do you understand? Izuku didn't know what to say. He understood the baseline of what his teacher was saying, but it felt not right. Like he understood the words, but he couldn't grasp onto them enough to internalize them. So instead, he just started crying again. He curled up against his teachers, his heroes, sighed, and just sobbed. After a while he managed a few words. Thank you. Thank you. Of course, problem child. Shoyuta was going to punch the symbol of peace. Pushing a legacy like that onto a child. What was he thinking? And then telling him to shoulder the burden alone? With only a rival, was Bakugo even a rival? Or had Shoyuta been misreading that too? Knowing his luck and Midoriya's luck, he was definitely misreading that. No wonder the kid had a breakdown. And what kind of bullshit was it to tell a kid who had almost killed himself that his life was only worth as many as he could save? Fucking what? Oh, Shoyuta was pissed. If he didn't have a lap full of crying, traumatized teenager, he'd be crashing the heroics class to beat All Might into the fucking pavement. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to do that just yet, so he settled for trying to get a little more knowledge about the situation. And Cammy, what a fucked up situation it was. Hey kid, I know you said that Bakugo knows, does anyone else know? The sniffles died down just enough for the teen to answer. Recovery girl knows. So does Nizu, Gran Torino, and that detective. Tsukachi, I think? Night Eye also knew, but Night Eye died. Christ, this kid had horrible fucking luck. Alright kid. Thank you so much for telling me. I'm sorry I didn't notice that something was up sooner. I promise that I'm going to do my best to be a better teacher from now on, okay? Thank you for trusting me with this. I know telling me was probably really hard. You're an amazing teacher, Aizawa-sensei. The best I've ever had. Aizawa hummed. His list of people to punch was growing exponentially. Not only did he have to punch All Might, but every other person who decided that keeping this a secret was okay. And every teacher who had ever done this kid, his kid, wrong. I can't believe that recovery girl didn't think to get you extra help, even just to keep you out of her office. Aizawa hadn't really meant to say that out loud, but he had, and oh boy was he pissed at the kid's response. Recovery girl tried to help, I think. She told me she'd stop healing me if I kept hurting myself, to encourage me to learn control faster. What? That's actually part of the reason I called you on Sunday instead of her. Kid, holy shit, that's very illegal. That is not okay. She didn't even help give you ideas on how to learn control? Just threatened to withhold medical treatment from you if you didn't? That's horrible. She could get her medical license revoked for that. You can lose your medical license for withholding treatment? The kid sounded shocked. Yes, that's like Rule 101 of medical practice. Doctors are supposed to treat anyone who's injured, no matter how it happens or who it happens to. I guess I didn't think of that. I always used to be turned away for being quirkless, so I never realized that it wasn't normal for doctors to pick and choose, I guess. The list of people for Aizawa to punch and/or murder was growing exponentially. You were turned away for being quirkless? That's like extra illegal, problem child. It adds quirk discrimination to the mix. Kid, I cannot even begin to explain how many things are wrong with that. Is that why you're so far ahead in the first aid unit? Izuku nodded, and Aizawa felt sick. Kemi, this kid. The world had just beaten him down again and again. Thank you, Aizawa-sensei, for caring. Even just telling you. It makes everything just a little less overwhelming, you know? Of course, problem child. I'm here, okay? I'm here. And somehow, hearing Aizawa's soft "I'm here" was just so much better than hearing All Might's trademark "I am here." And wasn't that something? Shoyuta was going to commit murder. Or, at the very least, he was going to threaten murder until he was given some goddamn answers, and then depending on those answers, he may or may not commit murder. The first on his hit list was All Might. Shoyuta had never loved the man's personality but had always respected him as a hero. Now though, All Might had been cast in an entirely new light. To think if Izuku had been even slightly less determined, he probably would have taken the fast track off of that roof instead of the stairs. Following All Might was every single teacher or medical professional that Izuku ever had prior to UA. Fuck, Shoyuta wanted to burn his school to the fucking ground. Hopefully, if he opened a case, he'd be able to. The next on the list were Nizu and Recovery Girl. Shoyuta had his suspicions that Nizu probably had some reason or another to keep this from him, but if those reasons weren't up to his standards, then Shoyuta was going to throttle his mentor. And Recovery Girl? He didn't give a shit about her reasons. Whatever the reasons were, they would never, ever be enough to warrant withholding medical treatment. Gran Torino and Tsukaushi were also on his list, but he had a sneaking suspicion that neither of the two men really knew the whole situation. They didn't seem to be as involved as everyone else, and based on what Shoyuta knew of the detective, he was level-headed and would sometimes act as a voice of reason for the symbol of peace. However, if they were aware of the whole situation and were fine with it, then they'd jump right up the list to the same places as Nizu and Recovery Girl. As for Bakugo, Shoyuta was unsure what to do about the teen. Chances are he was in a similar position to Izuku when it came to keeping the secret. He was just listening to All Might and assuming that the symbol of peace knew best. But Izuku and Bakugo had also gone to the same middle school and had also grown up together. Based on their interactions from the beginning of the year, as well as what Shoyuta knew about quirkless discrimination, Shoyuta determined that perhaps their friendly rivalry wasn't quite that. Or rather, hadn't been at the beginning. There was no denying that the relationship between the two had improved over their time at UA, but Shoyuta had little to no doubt that at the beginning it was a bully and victim relationship rather than a rivalry. He was glad that the two seemed to be improving, but that didn't mean he was about to ignore what he was seeing. He'd have to have a meeting with Bakugo to learn more about the situation. Then he'd decide what to do. Judging from what he knew, however, Bakugo would probably be due for some sort of disciplinary action, maybe something along the lines of community service. Then he'd get the kid into some mandatory anger management. In all honesty, if it weren't for all the chaos of the year, Aizawa probably would have organized some sort of anger management for the kid earlier. He had meant to after the hot mess that was the battle trials at the beginning of the year, but then USJ happened, and then everything else happened and he never managed to get around to it. That was on him though. Even such a shit show of a year, he still should have been able to see the problems and help his students. But no point in dwelling on what could have been done. Instead, he just put all of his energy into the best courses of action for now. Probably a lot of emails and meetings to start off. For now, however, Shoyuta was just stuck on the couch under a shockingly heavy, sleeping teenager. Seriously, how many times had this kid cried himself to sleep in the last several days? More than was healthy for sure. It was a wonder how the kid managed so many tears. If Shoyuta hadn't just learned about the kid's haunted quirk, he might have thought endless tears was his quirk instead. It was good that he was letting it all out though. As much as seeing his kid cry and listening to the absolutely heart-wrenching sobs hurt, it was definitely better than the kid keeping it all inside. Shoyuta knew that much from experience. He was glad that the kid trusted him enough to tell him all of this. It must have been hard for him to actively disobey his mentor. Problem child practically worshipped the ground that the man walked on. Which meant that Shoyuta had all the more reason to be pissed at the man. While Shoyuta sat to let the kid get some well-deserved rest after such a draining conversation, he let his mind wander to the best ways for him to break All Might's face. Izuku was nervous and quite frankly really fucking tired. He'd fallen asleep on Aizawa earlier and slept through a good portion of the day, but he was ready for another nap. The crying fest that was his morning had taken a lot out of him and he wasn't too excited to walk into another one. The first had been draining enough, what with exposing his secrets and problems to his mentor. That? Who knows at this point? He really didn't need to deal with his mom crying after all of that. But putting off seeing his mom wouldn't make anything easier to deal with. So Izuku was as prepared as he could be to just get it over with. He and Aizawa were walking to a secluded room in the main school building on campus. An old office that wasn't really used anymore, and they were bringing some food that Lunch Rush had made so that he and his mom could eat dinner while they caught up. Izuku was worried that there would be too many tears for them to actually eat the food, but the thought was nice. And who knows? Maybe he'd be able to calm his mother enough to get her to eat something rather than just sobbing into his shoulder the whole time. Don't get Izuku wrong, he was very grateful that his mom cared enough to cry over his well-being. He just wasn't looking forward to being the one to comfort her. He was glad that she'd received the news of his troubles while she was with her friends at least. Aside from Mitsuki and Mazu, she didn't have any friends in the area, so she had gone out of town to meet up with some of her other friends. Hopefully they were able to comfort her initially and she wouldn't be quite as wound up as she was originally. Izuku knew it was a bit odd that she hadn't gotten on the first train back as soon as she heard the news, but he was grateful for it. His mom had always been a bit overprotective of him. It started when he got his diagnosis, like it was a disease. Like being quirkless was some disgusting death sentence. And wasn't it? And continued on after he started getting into trouble at UA. Maybe her staying away was her way of trying to give him some space after low-key smothering him his whole life? Whatever her reasoning for staying away was, Izuku was glad that he at least got a few days to cool down after everything that had happened. He wasn't sure how he would have handled his mom's everything right when he woke up. You with me, kid? Izuku shook himself out of his thoughts and managed to smile at his teacher. Yeah. Just thinking. Aizawa nodded and they continued on in comfortable silence. Inko was already waiting for Izuku in the room. They had just stopped to pick up the food on the way. Izuku could feel himself get more and more anxious as they walked, which combines with how tired he was, ended up being a very strange combination. Did his heart have the energy to beat so fast even when he felt like he could curl up and go to sleep in the hallway? The guilt that had been lingering in his head was becoming harder and harder to ignore too. Who was he to be so anxious? His mom had probably felt so much worse when she'd heard what he'd done. He'd caused her so much grief and stress, especially after starting at UA, that he didn't think there'd ever be a way to make it up to her. Izuku nibbled on his lip. A sore was starting to form where he'd been chewing on it and it was surprisingly painful, but at least it was giving him something to focus on. Hey, gentle on yourself, problem child. Aizawa had shifted the bag he was carrying to one hand and used his other to tap Izuku's chin. So much for that. Sorry, Aizawa. Izuku said with a sheepish grin. You know, if you need a few minutes to breathe before you meet with your mother then that's fine. I'm okay. I just want to see her and get it over with. Not that seeing her is like a bad thing, it's not like I don't want to see her, I mean dash. Breathe. It's okay. Remember what I said earlier? Izuku nodded. It doesn't make you a bad person or a bad son to be hesitant about seeing her. It's tiring to have to comfort someone when they're worrying about you. Izuku tried to focus on that. Aizawa was smart, and a very good person as far as Izuku was concerned, so chances were that he knew what he was talking about. Kami, Aizawa-sensei was the best teacher that Izuku had ever had. He was trustworthy and nice, and didn't sugarcoat things or treat Izuku like a worthless piece of glass, and he was turning really red? Izuku was speaking out loud. Damn it. Well, I'm glad you think so, problem child. It's only logical that I treat you the way that I do. Aizawa trailed off at the end and coughed, keeping his eyes focused forward. Izuku had never seen his teacher embarrassed before. If Izuku weren't so embarrassed himself, he might have teased the man. Too bad he was too embarrassed to even squeak in response. "Here we are, kid. Let me know when you're heading back to the apartment, okay? And feel free to text or call me if you need anything or want someone to walk you back. I hope you have a nice time with your mother. Do you want me to say hi, or just leave you to it?" You can just leave me to it. I can take the bag. Thank you." Izuku took the bag of food that Aizawa was carrying and waved to his teacher before opening the door. "Hi, Mum." Inko was sitting on a small couch off to the side, next to an equally small coffee table. The office was small, but not cramped, and was impeccably clean despite showing no signs of use. Inko immediately lit up when she saw him, before dissolving into tears as she crossed the room to embrace her son. "Oh, Izuku baby. It's so good to see you." Izuku did his best to hug her back around the things in his arms and let himself deflate. As anxious as he was, and as much as he was not looking forward to this conversation, there were few things in the world as comforting as a true hug from his mom. Even though he could feel her shoulders shaking and could feel a damp spot growing on his shoulder, he let himself feel like a little kid being comforted after scraping his knees. He let himself feel small. It was nice. Really fucking nice. "Oh dear, here, set the food down. How are you, honey? Are you feeling all right? Is your teacher here?" His mom poked his head around her son's shoulders to peer out the door. "No, he left. And I'm doing pretty well, all things considered. It's good to see you." Izuku sent his mom a wobbly smile as he started getting the food out. Inko nodded and sat back down, tears still trickling down her cheeks as she watched him. He let her stare until he had set out the 2 containers of katsudon, as well as 2 sweet buns, and a thermos of jasmine tea with 2 cups. Izuku got another, shorter hug once he sat down, and then neither of them said anything. Izuku stared at the corner of the table, wringing his hands, while his mom stared at him. Inko chewed on her lip. "Must be where he picked up the habit. I'm glad you're all right, baby. I was so worried. I'm so worried. For now, I'm just glad you're okay." Izuku shot her another wobbly, lopsided smile. "Yeah, I'm okay. How are you? Was your trip good?" His mom nodded and took the conversation delay for what it was as she relayed her weekend to him. Fuck, it really had only been a few days, hadn't it? It felt like forever. Izuku choked down some of his food while she talked, but he didn't have much of an appetite and had to consciously remind himself not to spit each bite out as soon as it entered his mouth. His mom eventually moved on to ask about school and then about his friends. She tentatively asked how it had been staying with his teachers, and he happily told her about how nice his teachers were and how great Toshi had been. His mother laughed and raised an eyebrow suggestively when she heard the nickname, and Izuku resolutely ignored her. "And how has that little girl been? Eri? She lives at the teacher's dorms as well, doesn't she?" Izuku smiled, this time more easily. He loved Eri. "Yeah. She was great the last time I saw her. Nizu-san is starting to tutor her and she's taking it really well. I haven't seen her in the last couple of days, though. I think she's staying with Midnight Sensei right now. I know she rotates between the different teachers because they're all so busy." Izuku wouldn't be surprised if the teachers were keeping Eri away from him for a little while. It was always difficult explaining self-harm and such to someone so young. Sadly, Eri would probably understand it better than other kids her age, given everything she'd been exposed to. That said, Izuku had a suspicion that the teachers were going to wait a few days more before bringing up the idea of Izuku visiting her. They probably wanted to let him rest up first, and Izuku was glad for it. As much as he loved Eri and wanted to see her, she was still a little kid and didn't need to see her hero having such a hard time. It would be good to show her that it's okay to be hurting and that everyone struggles, but not right away. Not when the wounds were so fresh. Izuku needed time to get a hold of himself before having such a talk with her. They'd have to tread a fine line between showing her that it's okay to feel negative emotions, without pushing too far or stressing her too much. They'd probably wait until Izuku was feeling better, then put the situation into kid-friendly terms for her once Izuku had dealt with the bulk of his emotions. "That's good, I'm glad." Inko smiled softly, before biting her lip again. Izuku took a breath as he watched tears gather in her eyes again, and he let her gather her thoughts. You know, when I first got that call from your teacher, I wanted to pull you from the hero course. Izuku froze, but Inko continued, I had it all planned out. I'd transfer you to general education so you could stay in the same place as your friends and still have the protection of the teachers. I thought that even though you might hate me for it, that it would be my way to protect you. I thought that, maybe if you were less stressed, that you'd stop hurting yourself. That you wouldn't turn to such a self-destructive coping mechanism. I've never wanted you to be a hero, Izuku. You hurt yourself by jumping into villain fights, and then you don't even stop hurting yourself when you're at home. It's not I've never wanted this. Not for you. Not for my baby. Izuku couldn't breathe. He couldn't move. He knew that she'd be worried and upset, but pulling him from the hero course? He thought that she'd gotten over that after her conversation with All Might when the dorms first opened. He didn't know how to respond. Then I realized that, as much as I was okay with you hating me for pulling you away from your dream, that wasn't all that would happen, right? You'd probably hate a lot more than me. You told me, a long time ago, the first time that I learned about these tendencies, that you didn't hate yourself, and that you'd never she choked up for a moment before continuing. You'd never kill yourself because you couldn't be a hero if you died. And I can't take that away from you. You didn't mean to do it this time, but I think if I pulled you from the hero course, you might just mean to do it in the future. And I don't want to think about it, but at the same time it's important that I do. It doesn't matter that I hate it, it has to be about what will make you happy. Or at least happier. Hero work. It's always been all there is for you, hasn't it? Ever since you were little. You were never going to do anything else. And if I took that away from you, I'd probably lose you. Even if you aren't doing okay right now, you're doing better than I've seen in years. You have this light, Izuku. And I stopped seeing it for so many years. But then it came back, once you started UA. It burned so bright, especially after you saved people like Eri and Koda. I realized that if I keep trying to protect you, all I'm going to do is smother that light. But baby, please stop doing this to yourself. I know I'm not the best mother, but I just want to help, even if I'm not the best person for that. That's why I didn't come home right away. I thought, maybe even though I've failed you so many times, maybe your teachers and friends wouldn't. And it sounds like they haven't. So, Izuku, I guess. I love you, and I want you to be happy, and I want you to know that even if I don't like it, I'm going to do my best to support you instead of protecting you this time. Because I can't protect you from everything, least of all yourself, so I might as well support you instead. Is that okay? Izuku was sobbing by the time his mom was done. Full on ugly crying, curled in on himself and barely breathing between sobs. His mom was crying too but kept her voice steady. She wrapped her arms around him and softly rocked her son back and forth, whispering sweet mumbles into his hair. That's okay. I'm glad. I love you. Izuku cried harder. He managed to choke out a response though. I love you too. So much,